I never believed my uncle when he said some places in British Columbia just aren't meant to be found. He'd tell me stories over coffee in his kitchen outside Prince George, tales about valleys that moved when you weren't looking, and about entire logging camps that disappeared between one survey and the next. I'd nod politely, chalking it up to too many years alone in the bush, too many winters where the darkness lasted 20 hours a day and did things to a person's mind. That changed the winter I took a wrong turn near Frost Hollow and stumbled on a cabin that shouldn't have existed. It was late February, that particular kind of cold that makes your lungs hurt when you breathe. I'd been checking fence lines on the northern edge of my property, land that bordered crown forest so thick and old that most maps just labeled it as wilderness. The snow had been falling since dawn, not heavy, but steady enough that my tracks disappeared behind me almost as fast as I made them. I knew these woods well enough, or thought I did, but when the light started failing around 4 in the afternoon, I realized I'd somehow gotten turned around. The landmarks I'd been using, a lightning-split pine, a rock formation that looked like a crouching bear, were nowhere to be found. That's when I saw the smoke. Just a thin gray line rising above the trees, maybe a quarter-mile northeast of where I stood. I felt a surge of relief. There weren't supposed to be any structures out here, but maybe the Forestry Service had put up a ranger station I didn't know about, or some hunter had built a rough shelter. Either way, it meant warmth and a chance to get my bearings before full dark set in. I pushed through the underbrush, following that ribbon of smoke. The forest was eerily quiet, the way it gets sometimes in deep winter, when even the wind seems to hold its breath. My boots crunched through the snow crust, and that was the only sound for long minutes until I broke through a stand of spruce and found myself in a small clearing. The cabin sat in the center like it had grown there. It was old, constructed from hand-hewn logs gone gray with age, the chinking between them dark and crumbling. The roof sagged in the middle, heavy with snow, and the windows were small and dark. But smoke definitely rose from the stone chimney, a steady stream that smelled of burning pine and something else I couldn't quite place, something that made my stomach turn. What stopped me cold were the footprints. They led from the tree line to the cabin door, small impressions in the fresh snow. A child's prints, I thought, though something about their spacing seemed off. They were too evenly spaced, too deliberate, like someone had placed each foot with careful precision. And they were fresh, so fresh I could see the individual treads, no fill-in from the falling snow. I called out, my voice sounding flat and strange in the muffled air. "Hello? Is someone here? Is everything all right?" Nothing. Just that thin smoke rising and the silent forest pressing in from all sides. I moved closer, my unease growing with each step. The cabin looked like it had been standing for 50 years or more, but the smoke suggested recent occupation. The door was rough wood, weathered to silver, with an old iron latch instead of a modern handle. I knocked, the sound dull and heavy. "Hello? I'm lost. I don't mean to intrude. Just need to use a phone if you have one, or get directions back to the main road." Still nothing. But I could hear something now, faint under the whisper of falling snow. A crackling that had to be the fire inside, and maybe the sound of something moving, though it was so soft I couldn't be sure. The latch lifted easily when I tried it, too easily for something that looked so old. The door swung inward without a creak, and warmth spilled out into the frozen air, carrying with it that smell I'd noticed from the chimney. Burning wood and something underneath, something organic and slightly sweet, like meat left too long before cooking. I stepped inside and stopped, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The cabin's interior was a single room, maybe 20 feet by 20 feet, with exposed beam ceiling and the same hewn log walls. A fire burned in a fieldstone hearth, the flames bright and eager. Beside it sat a cast iron pot on a small wood stove, and I could see steam rising from whatever simmered inside. The table was set for 2 rough wooden plates, tin cups, mismatched silverware laid out with careful precision. A rocking chair sat near the fire, and through a narrow doorway I could see what looked like a small bedroom. Everything suggested someone had just stepped out for a moment. The fire was well tended, the food warm, the table ready. But the layer of dust on the chairs told a different story. It wasn't a light dusting, the kind that might accumulate in a few days. This was thick, undisturbed dust, the kind that takes months or years to settle. The same dust covered the windowsills, the mantel, even parts of the table between the place settings. It coated everything except the path from the door to the stove to the bedroom, a narrow trail through the gray powder, marked by those same small footprints I'd seen outside. My hands were shaking now, and not from the cold. I knew I should leave, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and walk back into the winter dark, but something held me there. Some awful fascination that made me move deeper into that room. The photographs on the mantel caught my eye. They were old, faded to sepia, in frames that had probably been nice once but were now tarnished and cracked. Family portraits from the 1950s, judging by the clothing and the style. A woman in a flower print dress stood beside a young boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. In every picture, and there were 5 of them lined up, they were looking directly at the camera, but their expressions weren't right. They weren't quite smiles, weren't quite frowns, just these strange, neutral looks that seemed to follow me as I moved. I picked up the center photograph, bringing it closer to the firelight. The woman's face was sharp and angular, her dark hair pulled back tight. The boy stood beside her, one hand on her arm, and his face was pale, almost luminous in the old photograph. But it was their eyes that bothered me most. Even through the fading and the age of the image, their eyes were too bright, too focused, like they were looking at something specific behind the camera, something they knew was there. The sound of footsteps on the porch made me drop the photograph. The glass shattered against the stone hearth, and in the sudden silence that followed, I heard them clearly. Small feet, moving with that same deliberate precision I'd noticed in the snow. Step, 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 approaching the door I'd left open behind me. I turned, my heart hammering so hard I thought my ribs might crack. The doorway was empty, showing only the dark trees and the falling snow beyond. But as I watched, the door began to close. Not quickly, not violently. It moved slowly, steadily, as if someone was pushing it shut from the outside with careful, measured force. The latch clicked into place. I lurched forward, grabbing for the door, but stopped mid-reach. Because now, I could see them, those same small footprints appearing in the dust on the cabin floor. They were forming right in front of me, indentations in the gray powder, each one appearing with a soft whisper of displaced dust. They came from the closed door, tracking across the room in a path that led directly toward where I stood. I couldn't move. I stood there, frozen, watching those impossible prints materialize one after another, coming closer. Step, step, step. I could hear them now, though there was nothing to make the sound. The soft pressure of small feet on old floorboards, moving toward me with terrible purpose. The prints stopped about 5 feet away, and the dust settled. For a moment, nothing happened. I stood there, breathing hard, my mind empty of everything except pure, animal terror. Then the rocking chair beside the fire began to move. Back and forth, like someone had just sat down in it. The wood creaked with each motion, and I could see the seat compress slightly under invisible weight. That broke whatever paralysis held me. I didn't go for the front door. Something in me knew that door wouldn't open, not now. Instead, I ran for the bedroom, some desperate instinct telling me there had to be another way out. A back door, a window, something. I burst through the narrow doorway and stopped dead. The bedroom was smaller, barely large enough for the narrow bed against one wall. But that's not what made me stop. It was the walls. Every inch of them was covered in photographs, hundreds of them, all tacked up with rusted pins. And they were all the same. The woman and the boy, over and over, in that same pose, with those same wrong expressions. But as my eyes adjusted to the dimmer light, I realized they weren't quite the same. In some pictures, there were other people in the background. Blurred figures, always out of focus, always facing away or partially hidden. And in each successive photograph, those background figures were closer to the camera, closer to the woman and the boy. The most recent picture, pinned at eye level directly in front of me, was different. The woman and the boy were still there, still staring out with those 2 bright eyes. But now there was a third figure in the photo, clear and in focus. A man, standing behind them, his hand on the boy's shoulder. His face was twisted in an expression of absolute terror, mouth open in a silent scream, and he was looking directly at the camera with desperate, pleading eyes. I recognized him. He'd been a trapper who worked the Crown lands north of Prince George. Disappeared 3 winters ago during a routine check of his line. They'd found his truck at the edge of the forest. Door open, engine still running. Never found him. The rocking chair had stopped creaking. The cabin was absolutely silent now, so quiet I could hear my own pulse thundering in my ears. And then, from right behind me, I heard breathing. Small, shallow breaths that fogged in the cold air I could suddenly feel on the back of my neck. I don't remember breaking the window. I know I went through it, glass and old wood and all, out into the snow and the darkness. I ran blindly, branches tearing at my face and clothes, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran until my legs gave out and I collapsed in the snow, shaking so hard my teeth rattled. When I finally found the strength to look back, there was nothing behind me but dark trees. No light from any cabin, no smoke rising through the canopy, just endless forest and falling snow. I found my way back to the fence line as dawn broke, following it home with numb feet and frost in my beard. I went back the next day with 2 friends from town, brought them to where I thought the cabin should be. We searched for 3 hours, found nothing but unbroken forest, not even old foundation stones. My friends were kind about it, said the cold and dark can play tricks on anyone. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, on the clearest winter nights, I can hear it. Small footsteps on my porch, always stopping right outside my door. The sound of a rocking chair creaking on wood floors. And if I make the mistake of looking out the window, I'll see them. The woman and the boy, standing at the edge of the tree line, their faces turned toward my house. They're always looking directly at me with those same wrong expressions that aren't quite smiles. They're patient. They've been waiting a long time. And I think they're getting closer. My uncle died last month. Heart attack, they said. Though he was healthy as a horse, they found him in his kitchen, sitting at his table with a photograph clutched in his hand. An old picture from the 1950s showing a woman in a flower print dress and a young boy standing beside her. When I saw it at the funeral, I noticed something in the background I'd missed before. Another figure, blurred and out of focus, standing behind them. It was my uncle, looking straight at the camera with terrified eyes. I don't go into the woods anymore, and I've been thinking about moving, maybe somewhere south, somewhere the winter doesn't last so long. Because every time it snows now, I wake to find those small footprints in the powder on my porch, leading up to my door and stopping just outside. They're closer every time. And one night soon, I know I'm going to wake up and find that the footprints don't stop at the door anymore. Driving Highway 16 inches January is already unsettling, even in daylight. They call it the Highway of Tears for a reason, and it's not a nickname the tourism board puts on their brochures. Too many women have gone missing along this stretch of asphalt that cuts through the northern interior of British Columbia. Too many families still waiting for answers that never come. I knew all of this when I decided to make the drive from Prince Rupert to Prince George. Knew it and told myself I'd be fine because I'd leave early, arrive before dark, stay on the main highway. But my shift at the fish processing plant ran late, and by the time I got on the road it was already past 8 in the evening. I told myself it would be okay. It was only a 6-hour drive, and I'd done it a dozen times before. The highway was straight and well maintained, and my car was reliable. I had a full tank of gas, a charged phone, and enough coffee to keep me alert through the night. What I didn't account for was the temperature. It had been cold all week, but that night it dropped to -35, the kind of cold that makes the air feel solid, that turns your breath to ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. About 2 hours into the drive, somewhere past Terrace, my car started making a sound I'd never heard before, a grinding, stuttering noise from under the hood that got worse with every kilometer. I was near Smithers when the engine finally died. No warning lights, no gradual loss of power. One moment I was doing 80 on the empty highway, the next I was coasting to a stop on the shoulder, my headlights dimming to nothing as the electrical system failed. I tried the ignition 3 times, pumping the gas pedal, whispering desperate prayers to a God I hadn't talked to since I was a kid. Nothing, just clicking sounds and the immediate, crushing cold as the heater died. I grabbed my phone, hands already shaking. No service. Of course there was no service. This stretch of highway ran through a dead zone that lasted for nearly 40 kilometers. I was completely alone, stranded at 2 in the morning in temperatures that could kill me in less than an hour if I stayed in the car without heat. I put on every layer. I had 2 sweaters, my heavy parka, an extra pair of socks over my hands because I'd forgotten gloves. Then I got out and opened the hood, even though I knew next to nothing about engines, and couldn't see much anyway with just my phone's flashlight. Everything was frozen solid, covered in a layer of frost that glittered in the weak beam. I touched the engine block and jerked my hand back. It was ice cold, like the car had been sitting there for hours instead of minutes. That's when I started to panic, really panic. Not just the nervous flutter in my stomach, but the full-body terror that makes your thoughts scatter like birds. I was going to die out here. They'd find me in the morning, frozen in my car, or collapsed on the roadside trying to walk to help that was too far away. I'd become another statistic, another name whispered when people talked about Highway 16 and all the ghosts it collected. I was standing there, spiraling into that dark place, when I saw the headlights. They appeared from the east, coming around the curve about a kilometer back, cutting through the snow that had started to fall. I felt a surge of relief so intense it made me dizzy. I stumbled out into the road, waving my arms, not even caring that I might get hit, because at least that would be faster than freezing. The vehicle slowed as it approached, and I could see it was an old pickup truck, maybe from the 80s, dark blue or black under the road salt and grime. It pulled onto the shoulder about 20 feet ahead of my car, and the driver's door opened. An older man climbed out, moving with the stiff, careful motions of someone whose joints didn't work like they used to. He was dressed in a heavy canvas jacket and a trucker's cap, his face weathered and lined in the way that comes from decades of hard work outdoors. "Car trouble?" he called out, his breath fogging in the headlights. "Won't start," I said, my voice coming out higher and more desperate than I wanted. "And my phone has no service. I don't know what's wrong with it." He nodded like this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Nothing to be done about it tonight. Too cold for diagnostics anyway. I can give you a lift to Smithers, get you somewhere warm. You can call a tow in the morning." I hesitated for just a moment. Everything they tell you about not getting into cars with strangers, all those warnings that get drilled into you, especially as a woman, especially on this highway. But what choice did I have? Stay and freeze, or take the risk? When you put it like that, there's really no choice at all. "Thank you," I said, and climbed into the passenger side of his truck. The interior smelled like cigarettes and old coffee, and the bench seat was cracked vinyl that had been patched with duct tape. But it was warm, gloriously warm, and I could feel sensation starting to return to my fingers and toes. The dashboard was old-fashioned, all analog gauges and metal knobs, with a CB radio mounted under it, its display giving off a faint green glow. The driver got in beside me, pulled the truck back onto the highway without a word. He drove with both hands on the wheel, sitting upright and rigid, staring straight ahead at the road. I tried to make conversation, thank him again, ask his name, but he didn't respond. Just kept driving, the only sounds the rumble of the engine and the hiss of the heater. We drove for maybe 20 minutes before I noticed something wrong. A mile marker passed by the window, and something about it nagged at me. The number was 246. I was sure of it, but then, a few minutes later, I saw it again. Mile marker 246. Identical placement, same small dent in the post. I told myself I was mistaken, that all mile markers looked alike in the dark and snow. But then we passed it a third time. Mile marker 246, and this time I was certain. I'd been watching for it, and there it was, in the exact same spot relative to a distinctive dead tree on the right side of the road. "We just passed that same marker," I said, my voice tight. 3 times. We're going in circles." The driver didn't respond, didn't even glance at me, just kept driving with that same rigid posture, hands at 10 and 2, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Did you hear me?" I said, louder now. "We're not getting anywhere. We keep passing the same." The CB radio crackled to life, cutting me off. A woman's voice came through the static, thin and desperate. "Please, if anyone can hear me, I'm stranded on Highway 16, about 10 kilometers past Terrace. My car broke down and I can't get it started. It's so cold. Please, is anyone there?" My blood went ice cold. Another voice followed. Different woman, same desperation. "This is Sarah Chen. I'm on Highway 16 near the Morristown turnoff. I need help. My car won't start and I have no phone service. Please, someone help me." Then another, and another. Women's voices, all of them, coming through that radio one after another, all calling for help, all giving locations along Highway 16. Some of the voices were clear, others buried in static. Some sounded recent, modern speech patterns and references. Others had an older quality, using phrases that felt like they came from decades ago. I sat there, listening to this chorus of the lost, and felt something crack inside my chest, because I recognized the locations they were calling from. I'd passed some of them on my drive. They were the places where women had vanished, where cars had been found abandoned, where searches had turned up nothing but questions. One voice came through clearer than the others, and I felt my stomach drop. I'm stranded on Highway 16, near the 246-kilometer marker, just past Smithers. Please, my car died, and I need help. That was my voice. My exact words, from when I'd tried my phone before I realized there was no service. But I hadn't been on a call. I hadn't been broadcasting. How was my voice coming through that radio? The driver spoke for the first time since we'd started driving, and his voice was rough, choked with an emotion I couldn't name. They always call, I always listen, but I can never find them in time. His voice broke on the last word, and I turned to look at him. Really look at him. For the first time since I'd gotten in the truck, his face was lined with grief, with years of pain that had carved channels down his cheeks. And his eyes, when they flickered toward me for just a moment, were hollow things, emptied out by whatever burden he carried. What do you mean? I whispered. Who are they? He didn't answer. The radio kept crackling, voices overlapping now, all of them calling out from different points along this cursed stretch of highway, all of them asking for help that never came. I looked down at his hands on the steering wheel, and that's when I saw it. In the green glow from the dashboard, I could see through them. Not completely, they weren't ghost movie transparent, but I could see the outline of the steering wheel through his fingers, could see the faint shape of the seat through his wrists, like he was there but not there, solid and insubstantial at the same time. The truck was slowing down. I tore my eyes from his impossible hands and looked out the windshield, and my heart stopped. There, ahead in the headlights, was my car, sitting on the shoulder exactly where I'd left it, in the exact same position. But something was different. The headlights were on. The engine was running. I could see the exhaust rising in the cold air. No, I said, though I wasn't sure what I was saying no to. No, this can't be. The truck rolled to a stop behind my car, and the driver finally turned to look at me fully. His face was devastating in its sorrow, in its terrible understanding of something I couldn't grasp. I was a tow truck driver, he said quietly. Worked this highway for 30 years. All those calls that came in, all those women who needed help, I tried to get to them. God knows I tried. But the highway is long and the winter is cold, and I was always too late. Always just too late. The radio voices were getting louder, more insistent, layering over each other, until it was just a wall of desperate sound. I had a heart attack, he continued, out here on the highway, responding to another call. They found me 3 days later, frozen in my truck, and now I drive. Every night I drive, and I listen to the calls, and I try to help, but I can never find them, can never get there in time. I just drive in circles, listening to them call, and I can't. His voice broke completely. I can't help them. I was crying now, I realized, tears freezing on my cheeks in the cold air that had somehow crept back into the truck. But you found me. You helped me. He shook his head slowly. Did I? Look at your car. I looked. The headlights were on. The engine was running. And sitting in the driver's seat, I could see a figure, a woman, slumped against the steering wheel. No, I breathed. No, I got out. I was stranded, but I got out. You picked me up. The cold works fast, he said gently. Fast enough that you don't always know when it's got you. Fast enough that sometimes your mind makes up stories to make it easier, to make the ending less lonely. I looked down at my own hands. In the green light from the dashboard, they looked solid, real. But when I held them up to the windshield, I could see through them. Just barely. Just enough. The radio crackled one more time. My voice came through, clear and desperate. Please, if anyone can hear me, I'm stranded on Highway 16, near the 246-kilometer marker. My car died and I need help. Please. I hear you, the driver said, his voice heavy with decades of grief. I always hear you, but I can never find you in time. He reached across and opened the passenger door. Cold air rushed in, but I couldn't feel it anymore. Couldn't feel much of anything. You should go back to your car now, he said, before you forget where it is. Some of them wander too far, and then they really are lost. I got out of the truck on legs that didn't quite feel like mine anymore. The snow was falling harder, covering everything in white. I could see my car ahead, could see myself slumped in the driver's seat, and I knew I should feel something about that. Terror, denial, something. But all I felt was tired. Behind me, I heard the truck's engine rev. I turned to see it pulling back onto the highway, heading east, the same direction it had been going when it found me. Through the rear window, I could see the driver's silhouette, hunched over the wheel, listening to his radio, listening to the voices of all the lost women calling out for help he could never give. I walked back to my car and opened the door. The body in the driver's seat was mine, frozen solid, my phone clutched in one stiff hand. I slid into the passenger seat instead because the driver's seat was occupied, and I waited. I'm still waiting. My voice still calls out on that CB radio, somewhere out there in the night. And sometimes on the coldest nights I see headlights approaching. I watch them come closer, full of hope that maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time someone will arrive in time. But they never do. They drive right past, or they stop, and it's him again, the tow truck driver, and we go through the same conversation, the same terrible revelation, over and over. And each time I forget a little more. Forget what it felt like to be warm. Forget the faces of people I loved. Forget everything except the cold and the waiting and the sound of my own voice calling out for help that never comes. If you drive Highway 16 late at night and your radio picks up strange calls, women's voices asking for help, listen. We need someone to listen, even if you can't help, even if we're already gone. Just listen, it's all we have left. My job was simple enough on paper. Man, the remote weather station at Toad River for 3 months, take atmospheric readings every 6 hours, report the data via satellite uplink, and keep the equipment from freezing solid. The pay was excellent, considering all I had to do was sit in a heated building and push some buttons. They said it was isolated, warned me that I'd be completely alone from December through February, that the access road would be snowed in and impassable until spring. I'd done solitary work before, had spent summers as a fire lookout in the Yukon, so I figured I could handle it. What they didn't mention during the briefing in Whitehorse was that the previous operator had requested an emergency extraction after 6 weeks. I only found out about that when I was going through the logbooks my first week at the station, reading through months of meticulous weather observations that abruptly stopped in mid-January with a single line, "Cannot continue. Please send replacement immediately." No explanation, no details, just that desperate scrawl across the bottom of the page. The station itself was a small prefab building, maybe 20 feet by 15, dropped onto a concrete foundation in a clearing that had been carved out of the dense boreal forest. The nearest human being was a trapper about 40 kilometers south, and even he only worked his lines until the deep cold set in. Inside, the station was divided into 2 sections, a larger room with all the monitoring equipment, a small desk and a kitchenette, and a smaller bedroom with a narrow bunk and a wood stove for backup heat. The windows were double-paned and small, designed to retain heat rather than provide a view, and they looked out on nothing but snow and black spruce trees that pressed in from all sides. Everything went fine the first month. I fell into a routine easily enough. Wake at 5, take the morning readings, make coffee, eat breakfast. Read during the day. I'd brought 2 boxes of paperbacks with me and take the remaining readings at their scheduled times. The silence was absolute in a way that city people never experience. No traffic, no voices, no machinery, except the hum of the weather station's equipment, just wind in the trees and the occasional crack of timber contracting in the cold. It dropped to -40 most nights, sometimes colder, the kind of cold that makes the air itself feel hostile. I started hearing the knocking on day 32. The first time, I thought I dreamed it. I woke in the dark, my heart pounding for no reason I could identify, and lay there listening to the silence. Then I heard it again. 3 deliberate knocks, coming from somewhere below me, underneath the floor. I got up, turned on every light in the station, and stood in the middle of the main room, listening. Nothing, just the hum of the equipment and my own breathing. I checked the time on the monitoring station's display, 3:47 a.m. I was tired, I told myself. Probably heard the building settling or ice shifting in the foundation. I went back to bed but didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next night, I was ready. I stayed awake, sitting at the desk with a cup of coffee, watching the clock. At 3:47 exactly, the knocking started. 3 measured knocks, definitely coming from below the floor. I got down on my hands and knees, pressing my ear to the cold linoleum, and listened. The knocking came again, and it was definitely underneath me, in the crawl space between the floor and the frozen ground. There was an access panel in the bedroom, a 2-foot square of plywood that could be lifted to reveal the crawl space. I'd noticed it my first day but had never opened it, no reason to. Now I grabbed my flashlight and pried up the panel, the nails squealing in protest. Cold air rushed up, carrying with it the smell of frozen earth and old concrete. I shined the light down into the space below. It was shallow, maybe 18 inches between the floor joists and the dirt, crisscrossed with the concrete foundation posts that supported the building. Everything was covered in a thick layer of frost that glittered in my flashlight beam. I could see the underside of the floorboards, the bottom of the insulation, and absolutely nothing else. No animals, no obvious source for the knocking. Just frozen dirt and old concrete and that rime of ice on every surface. I closed the panel and tried to convince myself it was nothing. Permafrost shifting, the building settling on its foundation, something mundane and explainable. But the knocking continued. Every night at 3:47 a.m., those same 3 deliberate knocks from below the floor. By week 5, I reported it in my daily data transmission. I tried to keep my tone professional, just noting an unusual phenomenon for the record. The response came back the next day. Likely ice expansion in foundation, common in extreme cold, monitor but no action required. But ice doesn't knock in patterns. Ice doesn't create sounds that are rhythmic and deliberate, that happen at the exact same time every night. I knew the difference between random settling and something that had intention behind it, even if I didn't want to admit what that meant. Week 6 was when I started losing sleep in earnest. The knocking was getting louder, more insistent. It had expanded beyond those initial 3 knocks. Now it would go on for 5, sometimes 10 minutes. Knock, 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 pause, knock, 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 pause. Over and over in that same maddening rhythm. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the knocks, trying to find some pattern or meaning in them. I opened the crawl space access twice more, shining my light into every corner I could reach, looking for any explanation. Found nothing but frost and shadows, and that awful cold that seemed to radiate up from the ground itself. I even crawled partway into the space once, my shoulders barely fitting between the joists, dragging myself across the frozen dirt on my elbows. The frost was thicker deeper in, coating the foundation posts in layers of white that looked almost like ice. I could see my breath fogging in the flashlight beam, could feel the cold seeping through my clothes, even through the thermal layers. I didn't find anything, but something about being down there, in that narrow space with the weight of the building pressing down above me and the frozen ground below, filled me with a dread I couldn't shake. I backed out as quickly as I could, scraping my shoulders on the joists, and sealed the access panel with duct tape after I replaced it, like that would somehow keep whatever was down there contained. On week 7, on day 46 of my rotation, I found the scratch marks. I'd been doing my morning rounds, checking the external sensors, when I noticed something off about the snow around the foundation. There were depressions in it, running along the base of the building, like something had been digging. Not animal tracks, the marks were too regular, too deliberate. More like someone had been running their fingers along the foundation, pressing into the snow. That night, I couldn't help myself. I pulled up the access panel again, peeling away the duct tape, and shined my light down into the crawl space. At first, I didn't see anything different. Same frost, same shadows, same suffocating cold. Then I angled the light up toward the underside of the floorboards directly beneath where I slept. The frost on the underside of the boards was disturbed, scraped away in long, parallel lines that could only have been made by fingernails. Fresh marks, I could tell by the way the exposed wood was darker, not yet covered by a new layer of frost. 4 parallel scratches, dragged across the bottom of the floorboards, directly under my bed. I slammed the access panel shut and backed away from it, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. Something was down there, something that could reach the underside of my floor, could scratch at the wood while I slept above it. Something that existed in a space that shouldn't be large enough to hold anything bigger than a rat. I sent an emergency message that morning, requesting early extraction, citing equipment malfunction and personal emergency. The response was sympathetic but firm. Weather conditions made helicopter access impossible, and the access road wouldn't be passable for another 6 weeks. I could request evacuation if there was a genuine medical emergency, but otherwise, I needed to complete my rotation. I stopped sleeping in the bedroom after that. I dragged my mattress into the main room, as far from the access panel as I could get, and tried to rest in fitful stretches during the day. But the knocking continued every night at 3:47 a.m., and now I was close enough to hear it clearly without the bedroom wall muffling the sound. That's when I realized it had changed. The rhythm was different, more complex. It wasn't random knocking anymore. It had structure, pattern. I lay there in the dark, listening, and my blood went cold as I recognized what I was hearing. Morse code. Someone was knocking in Morse code. I'd learned it years ago, a Boy Scout badge requirement I'd long forgotten. But the pattern was unmistakable once I recognized it. Do 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 dash, dash do dash dash, do do do. I grabbed a pen and paper, started transcribing, my hands shaking so badly I could barely write. LATMU. Over and over the same message, knocking up from beneath the floor in deliberate, patient Morse code. Let me up, let me up, let me up. I sat there until dawn, listening to that impossible message being tapped out from the crawl space, from a space too small for anything human to occupy. When the sun finally rose and the knocking stopped, I got dressed, put on every layer I owned, and went outside. I needed to see the foundation from the outside, needed to understand how anything could be down there. The building sat on 12 concrete piers, sunk deep into the permafrost to prevent shifting. Between the piers and the floor was that 18-inch crawl space, open to the elements on all sides. I walked the perimeter, looking for any opening large enough for something to crawl through. Found nothing. The space was too shallow, too exposed. Nothing could be living down there. Nothing could survive in that cold, in that confined darkness. But the scratches were real. The knocking was real. And the message was being repeated every single night with mechanical precision. I started researching the station's history, going through the files that had been left for me. The building had been erected 15 years ago. The foundation poured in summer when the ground thawed enough to dig. Before that, this had just been empty forest, untouched and unmarked on any map. There was nothing in the records about the site's history, no mention of anything that might explain what I was experiencing. The previous operator's logs gave me nothing either, except that growing sense of desperation in the final entries. He'd started noting unusual sounds in week 4, had requested maintenance to check the foundation in week 5. His last few entries were terse, almost frightened. Sounds continue, cannot sleep, need to leave. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself I'd finish the rotation, collect my pay, and never come back. But every night at 3:47, that knocking would start. Let me up, let me up, let me up. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Always the same message, always in that same patient, deliberate rhythm. On day 63, I made the mistake of responding. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe the isolation had gotten to me more than I realized. Maybe I'd just reached a breaking point where even impossible communication seemed better than the silence. I got down on the floor and knocked back. 3 knocks, just like the pattern I'd heard that first night. The crawl space went silent, completely, utterly silent. I waited, barely breathing, my ear pressed to the cold floor. Nothing. No response, no repetition of the message, just absolute quiet that somehow felt worse than the knocking. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a single knock came back. Loud, so loud it rattled the floor beneath me. And then scratching, frantic scratching, directly underneath where I knelt. Not the slow, deliberate marks I'd seen before, but desperate, violent scratching like something trying to claw through the floorboards. I scrambled backward, watching in horror as frost began to form on the floor above where the scratching was concentrated. The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly, my breath suddenly visible in the air. The scratching intensified, and I could hear something else now beneath it, a sound that might have been breathing, or might have been the wind in the crawl space, or might have been something trying to form words. The floor began to bow upward, just slightly, the boards creaking under pressure from below. Something was pushing up, trying to force its way through the narrow gap between frozen earth and floor, through a space that physics said couldn't contain anything large enough to push that hard. I grabbed my parka and ran outside into the -40 night, not caring about the cold, not caring about anything except getting away from that building and whatever was trying to claw its way up through the floor. I stood in the clearing, watching the station's windows, half expecting to see something emerge, to see the floor rupture and release whatever had been trapped down there. But nothing happened. The building sat silent and still in the darkness, smoke rising from the chimney, lights burning warm and inviting, like nothing was wrong at all. I went back inside as the sun rose because I had nowhere else to go. The floor was intact, undamaged, the frost had melted, everything looked normal. But when I checked the crawl space, working up the courage to lift that access panel one more time, I saw that the scratches had multiplied. The entire underside of the floor was now covered in them, thousands of parallel gouges that had torn away most of the frost, exposing bare wood underneath. And in the dirt, directly below the access panel, someone had drawn a message with their finger. The words were crude, shaky, barely legible in the frozen earth. "I'm still here. I have 37 days left on my rotation." The knocking continues every night at 3:47, but the message has changed. It's not "let me up" anymore. Now it's something different, something that makes my blood freeze every time I hear it tapped out in that patient, deliberate code. It's counting down, starting from 37 and decreasing by 1 each night. I don't know what happens when it reaches 0. I don't know if the helicopter will reach me before then. I don't know if I'll have the courage to stay, or if I'll walk out into the winter dark and take my chances with the cold instead. But I know this: something is down there in that crawl space, in a space that shouldn't exist, in the frozen dark between the earth and my floor. Something that's been waiting, patient and deliberate, for someone to acknowledge it, someone to let it up. And God help me, I answered when it knocked. 4 snowmobilers went missing near Tumbler Ridge in February 2019, and I was part of the search and rescue team that found them, or what we thought was them. I'd been doing SAR work in northern British Columbia for almost 15 years by then, had pulled bodies from avalanche debris, and carried hypothermia victims down mountain slopes, had seen what the wilderness does to people who underestimate it. But nothing in all those years prepared me for what we found in that clearing. The call came in on a Sunday evening. 4 riders had left Tumbler Ridge that morning for a day trip into the backcountry. Experienced guys who knew the terrain and had good equipment. They were supposed to be back by 4. When they hadn't returned by 7 and weren't answering their radios, their families called it in. We assembled the team at 8, 12 of us plus 2 RCMP officers, and headed out on our own machines following the GPS trackers the missing riders had been carrying. The weather was marginal, temperature hovering around -25 with light snow falling. Not ideal conditions for a search, but not the worst I'd seen either. We followed their tracks easily enough at first, a clear trail heading northeast into the Crown land that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. They'd been riding hard, taking some aggressive lines through the powder, but nothing that suggested panic or distress. About 2 hours into the search, maybe 30 kilometers from town, we lost the tracks. Not gradually, the way you'd expect if snow had covered them, but abruptly. One moment, we were following clear sled marks through the trees. The next, we were staring at unmarked snow. It was like they'd just vanished into thin air. We spread out, searching in a grid pattern, calling on the radios. The GPS signals were still transmitting, showing all 4 sleds in a tight cluster about half a kilometer to our east. But when we tried to reach that location, we kept getting turned around. The terrain wasn't particularly difficult, just rolling hills covered in lodgepole pine, but somehow we couldn't seem to get to where the GPS said they were. We'd ride toward the coordinates and then find ourselves circling back to where we'd started, even though we were sure we'd been going straight. Tom Hendricks, our team leader, finally called for a break. We gathered in a small clearing to check our equipment and regroup, and that's when I noticed something wrong with the trees. The pines around us were all leaning slightly, and they were all leaning the same direction, not like they'd been bent by prevailing winds, which would have been gradual and natural. These trees were tilted at precise angles, maybe 15 degrees off vertical, all pointing toward the same spot to our northeast. I pointed it out to Tom, and he went quiet for a long moment, studying the trees with a frown. Then he checked his GPS again, and his face went pale in the light from his headlamp. The coordinates for the missing sleds were exactly in the direction the trees were pointing. We approached on foot this time, leaving our machines behind. The trees got stranger the closer we got, their trunks all tilted at that same unnatural angle, their branches reaching out like fingers pointing the way. The snow under our boots felt wrong too, crusty and uneven, like it had melted and refrozen repeatedly, even though we'd had solid cold for the past 2 weeks. We found them in a clearing about 100 meters across, and the sight stopped us dead in our tracks. Their snowmobiles were arranged in a perfect circle, headlights all pointing inward, engines still running. I could hear the idle of the motors, smell the exhaust mixing with the cold air. The fuel gauges were visible even from where we stood, all of them showing nearly empty. Those machines had been running for hours. In the center of the circle, standing in the snow, were the 4 riders. They were arranged back to back, facing outward toward the sleds, completely motionless. Even from a distance, I could see the frost coating their faces, their exposed skin, the condensation frozen in their beards and eyebrows. They were wearing their riding gear, but their helmets were off, lined up neatly between 2 of the sleds. Tom called out to them. No response. We moved closer, calling their names Dave Mitchell, Jason Chen, Robert LaRoque, and Marcus Dube. All of them local guys, all experienced backcountry riders. Still no response, though I could see their chests rising and falling with slow, regular breaths. They were alive. When we got within 10 feet, I could see their eyes were open. Not just open, but wide, staring out at nothing with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They didn't blink, didn't react to our lights or our voices. Just stood there, perfectly still, except for that slow breathing, frost building up on their faces with each exhale. I reached out to touch Dave's shoulder. I'd known him for years, had helped him build his garage the previous summer, and the moment my hand made contact, he spoke. Not to me, not in response to anything I'd said. He just spoke, his voice flat and emotionless, his eyes never moving from their fixed stare. Sarah puts the coffee on at 6:30 every morning. She uses the blue mug with the chip on the handle. She thinks about leaving you every time she pours it. My blood went cold. Sarah was my wife. She did use a blue mug with a chip, and I'd known for months that things between us weren't right, had felt her pulling away, but hadn't wanted to face it. Before I could process this, Jason spoke, his voice the same flat monotone. Your daughter keeps the bottle in the garage, behind the paint cans. She's been drinking since November. Tom made a choking sound. His daughter Emma was 17, had been acting different lately. Tom had worried but hadn't known what to think. Then they all started speaking, all 4 of them at once. Their voices perfectly synchronized, like they were reading from the same script. They described our houses, our families, intimate details they couldn't possibly know. Marcus described the affair one of our team members was having. Robert recited the exact contents of my last conversation with my mother, word for word, even though that conversation had happened in my kitchen 2 days ago while I was alone. We tried to move them, to break whatever trance they were in. The moment we touched them again, they shifted their message. Still in that same perfect unison, still without blinking or moving their eyes, they began to speak about the future. When the trees decide, Sarah will be in the kitchen. She'll be reaching for that blue mug, and her hand will stop halfway. She won't understand why she can't move. None of them will understand. The trees will decide, and everyone will stop, all at once, and the silence will be complete. They went on like this, describing scene after scene in horrifying detail. Our families frozen in their daily routines. The town stopped like a photograph, and through it all, this repeated phrase, when the trees decide. They said it like it was inevitable, like it was already happening somewhere we couldn't see. We got them onto our sleds, strapped them in because they wouldn't sit on their own, their bodies rigid and unyielding. They never stopped talking the whole ride back, speaking in perfect synchronization, their voices carrying over the engine noise with impossible clarity. None of us wanted to listen, but we couldn't help it. They described the exact moment each of us would die. They described what would be said at our funerals. They described who would forget us and how quickly. The hospital in Tumbler Ridge wasn't equipped for something like this. The ER doctor, Sarah Kwan, examined them while they stood in the emergency bay, still in that same back-to-back formation, still staring straight ahead. Their vital signs were wrong in ways that didn't make sense. Heart rates were slow but steady, around 30 beats per minute. Blood pressure was low but not critical. But their core temperature was what made Dr. Kwan's hands shake when she showed me the thermometer. 83 degrees Fahrenheit. All 4 of them, exactly the same temperature. 35 degrees below what a human being needs to survive. They should have been dead hours ago. But they were standing, breathing, speaking in that horrible unison about things they couldn't possibly know. They never stopped staring. Not when the nurses tried to get them into beds. Not when Dr. Kwan shined lights in their eyes. Not when their families came and broke down crying at the sight of them. They just stood there, backs together, eyes fixed on some point in the distance, and spoke in that synchronized monotone. The families couldn't take it, hearing their loved ones describe their private lives, their secrets, their fears, all while wearing those frost-covered faces and empty eyes. Dave's wife, Sarah, actually ran from the room when he started describing her mother's death, describing details from the nursing home in Edmonton that only Sarah knew, that Dave had never been told. Jason's parents collapsed when he recited conversations they'd had at their kitchen table just that morning, conversations about whether they should sell their house and move to Vancouver. We kept them under observation, hoping they'd snap out of it, that whatever had happened to them in that clearing would wear off. But 3 days passed and nothing changed. They stood in that hospital room, back to back, never blinking, never sleeping. The nurses had to force water into their mouths with droppers because they wouldn't drink on their own. Their core temperature never rose above 83 degrees. They should have been dead. Everyone kept saying it. Dr. Kwan said it. The specialist who drove in from Prince George said it. They should have been dead, but they weren't. On the third night, I was there when it happened. I'd been staying at the hospital more than going home, unable to shake the feeling that something was coming, some terrible conclusion to this nightmare. At exactly midnight, all four of them stopped talking at the same instant. The silence was so sudden, so complete after 3 days of their constant monotone, that it felt like a physical presence in the room. Then they spoke one more time, all together, that same perfect synchronization. But this time they weren't describing our lives or our futures. They were reciting numbers, GPS coordinates, I realized after a moment, latitude and longitude, precise to 6 decimal places. And then they died. All four of them, simultaneously, at exactly midnight. Their bodies just stopped functioning. Heart rates flatlined, breathing ceased, their eyes finally closing after 3 days of that endless stare. The monitors screamed their alarms, and the medical team rushed in, but there was nothing to be done. They were gone. I wrote down the coordinates before I left the hospital. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to know what that place was, why they'd been compelled to give us those numbers with their last breath. When I checked them on the map the next morning, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the GPS unit. The coordinates pointed to the exact center of that clearing, the place where we'd found them standing in their circle, where their snowmobiles had idled for hours, where something had happened that turned 4 experienced riders into something else. Something that knew things it shouldn't, something that could speak with one voice, something that had died at the exact same instant. I went back there 2 weeks later. I had to. I couldn't explain why, but those coordinates felt like an invitation, or maybe a warning. I rode out alone, against every rule of backcountry safety, and found the clearing without any trouble this time. The trees still leaned at those impossible angles, all pointing toward the center. The snow where the men had stood was darker than the surrounding white, stained with something I didn't want to examine too closely. Their helmets were still there, lined up between 2 sets of sled tracks that had long since been covered by new snow. I picked one up Dave's. I could tell by the custom paint job and noticed something I'd missed before. The inside was covered in frost, a thick layer of ice crystals that shouldn't have formed on something that had been worn on a living person's head. But it was the trees that made me understand, finally, what had happened. Or at least, what I thought had happened. Standing in the center of that clearing, surrounded by those leaning pines, I could feel it, a presence, an awareness. Not malevolent, exactly, but utterly alien. The trees weren't leaning because of wind or soil conditions. They were leaning because they were focused, all of them, on this one spot, watching it, waiting. When the trees decide, the men had said, over and over, those 4 words. And standing there in that clearing, feeling the weight of all those watching trees, I understood that they hadn't been warning us. They'd been explaining, telling us about something that was already in motion, something that had chosen them, used them, and then discarded them when their purpose was served. I left the helmet where I'd found it and rode back to town. I didn't tell anyone about the trip, didn't mention what I'd felt in that clearing. What would be the point? No one would believe me, and even if they did, what could anyone do? But I think about it every day, about 4 men standing in a circle, speaking with one voice, describing futures they couldn't possibly see, about core temperatures that should have killed them but didn't, about trees leaning at impossible angles, all focused on one point in the forest. about GPS coordinates given with dying breath, pointing back to where it all began. And sometimes, late at night, I stand at my window and look out at the tree line behind my house. The pines there seem straighter than they used to be, more vertical. But every once in a while, I think I see one of them lean, just slightly, just for a moment. And I wonder if it's starting again, if the trees are watching, if they're deciding. When Sarah makes coffee in the morning, using that blue mug with the chip, I watch her hands, waiting for the moment they might stop, waiting for the moment when the trees decide. Because those four men knew something, had seen something in that clearing that the rest of us haven't seen yet. And whatever it was, I don't think it's finished. The coordinates are still saved in my GPS. Sometimes I think about going back, about standing in that clearing one more time, but I'm afraid of what I might hear if I do. Afraid I might start speaking in that same flat monotone, describing things I shouldn't know, waiting for the moment when the trees decide. And the terrible thing is, I think it would be a relief to finally stop wondering, to finally understand. Even if understanding meant becoming like them, standing in the cold with frost on my face, speaking truths no one wants to hear, waiting for midnight to come. I found the camera in a tackle box at an estate sale in Prince George, one of those sprawling affairs where a lifetime's worth of possessions gets laid out on folding tables in a stranger's garage. The sale was for a man named Gerald Pritchard, a local who died ice fishing on Tabor Lake back in January. I didn't know him personally, but I'd heard the story. Experienced fisherman, went out alone on a cold Saturday morning, never came back. They found his truck at the boat launch 2 days later, found his gear set up on the ice, hole drilled, tip up ready. Found him face down in the water beneath the ice, about 20 feet from his fishing spot. Fell through, everyone said. Though that didn't make much sense. Gerald had been ice fishing that lake for 30 years. He knew how to check thickness, knew where the current weakened the ice, knew to avoid the spots where the creek fed in. But sometimes experience doesn't matter. Sometimes the ice takes you anyway, and everyone nods and says how tragic it is, how careful you have to be out there, how the lake can't be trusted even when it looks solid. The camera was a nice one, a waterproof digital model in a hard case, sitting at the bottom of a tackle box filled with lures and line and the small tools of the fisherman's trade. The woman running the sale, Gerald's daughter, I learned, said I could have the whole box for $20. I almost didn't buy it. I'm not much of a fisherman, but something about that camera caught my eye, and I figured even if I didn't use the tackle, a good waterproof camera was worth $20. I didn't look at the photos until I got home that evening. I'd spent the day organizing my garage, finding space for the tackle box, and didn't think to check the camera's memory card until I was winding down with a beer. I plugged it into my laptop, curious to see what Gerald had been photographing, maybe some nice shots of the lake or his catches from the season. The first dozen photos were exactly what I expected. Sunrise over Tabor Lake, the ice stretching out in that pale blue expanse that looks so solid and permanent. A few pictures of fish, decent-sized trout, a couple of char, the kind of catches you'd want to remember. Several selfies of Gerald, a stocky man in his 60s with a gray beard and a wide smile, holding up his catch or just grinning at the camera with the frozen lake behind him. Normal photos, the kind any fisherman would take. Then the photos got strange. Image 15 showed Gerald's ice hole from a different angle, not from above, where he'd be standing, but from below. The perspective was wrong, looking up through the dark water at the circle of daylight where he'd drilled through. I could see the edges of the hole, the rough texture of the ice around it, and through the opening, a slice of gray winter sky. I stared at the image, confused. It had to be a mistake, I thought. Maybe he'd dropped the camera in the water by accident, and it had taken a photo on the way down. But the image was too clear, too well framed, and the timestamp showed it was taken at 9:47 a.m., right in the middle of his fishing session. The next photo showed his boots, black insulated sorrels, standing at the edge of the ice hole, photographed from directly underneath. I could see the treads on the soles, the details of the stitching, even some snow clinging to the rubber. The angle was impossible. The camera would have had to be in the water, maybe a foot below the surface, pointing straight up at his feet. My hands started shaking as I clicked through the remaining images, photo after photo, all taken from below the ice. His fishing rod, photographed from underneath as he held it over the hole. His face, distorted by looking down through the ice and water, his eyes wide and focused on something below. The images were crisp and clear, the timestamps showing they were taken over a 3-hour period that Saturday morning. I checked the camera settings, thinking maybe there was some timer function, some way he could have set it to take photos automatically. Nothing. The camera was set to manual mode. Someone had pressed the shutter button for each of these photos. The final image stopped my heart. It showed Gerald's body floating face down in the water, his arms spread out, his coat billowing around him. The photo was taken from below, looking up at him, suspended in that dark space between the ice and the lake bottom. Through the hole above him, I could see daylight, could see his fishing gear still set up on the surface. The timestamp read 12:34 p.m. According to the coroner's report that had been in the local paper, Gerald's estimated time of death was around 3:30 p.m. This photo was taken 3 hours before he died. I sat there staring at my laptop screen, my beer forgotten, my mind racing through impossible explanations. Someone else had been there with him. Someone who had taken his camera, had gone under the ice, had photographed him from below. But the police had found no other tracks, no evidence of anyone else at the scene. Gerald had been alone. I tried to delete the photos, selected them all, hit delete, watched them disappear from the folder. Then I ejected the memory card, my hands still trembling, and put the camera back in the tackle box. I didn't want to look at those images anymore, didn't want to think about what they meant or how they were possible. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that final image in my mind, Gerald floating in the dark water, photographed by a camera that should have been in his hand, not beneath the ice. Around 2 in the morning, I got up to get some water, and my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A notification from my Photos app. New photo added. I picked up the phone with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. I hadn't taken any photos. The phone had been sitting on my nightstand all night, but there it was, a new image in my camera roll, timestamped just seconds ago. The photo showed my ceiling, the white paint, the light fixture, a small water stain in the corner I'd been meaning to fix. Nothing unusual, except for the angle. The photo was taken from below, from underneath the floor of my bedroom, as if someone was lying under my house, pointing a camera up through the floorboards. I deleted it immediately, my heart hammering, checked every app on my phone, made sure no timer or automation was running, found nothing, went back to bed and lay there in the dark, staring at that ceiling, wondering what was underneath it. The next morning, my phone had 17 new photos. All of them showed my ceiling from that same impossible angle, some from the bedroom, some from the bathroom, one from the kitchen. I could track my movement through the house by the photos, like something was following me from below, photographing the ceilings above where I walked. I deleted them all, turned off my phone, pulled the memory card from Gerald's camera, and threw it in the trash. I told myself it was over, that whatever weird glitch or coincidence had caused this would stop now. But that night I heard it, a soft clicking sound, coming from below my bedroom, regular, rhythmic, like a camera shutter. Click, pause, over and over, directly beneath where I lay. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and went outside in my pajamas. My house is raised on a foundation with a crawl space underneath, about 2 feet of clearance between the ground and the floor. I got down on my hands and knees, shined the light under the house, and saw nothing but dirt and the occasional cobweb. No camera, no person, nothing that could explain the clicking sound I'd heard. Back inside, I checked my phone even though it was still powered off, turned it on, watched it boot up, and saw the notification immediately. 43 new photos, all of them showing my ceiling from below. And in the most recent one, taken just moments ago, I could see my own shadow on the ceiling, the shadow of me standing in the room, cast by the flashlight I was holding. Something underneath my house was photographing me in real time. I called a friend, Mike, told him I had a pest problem, asked if he'd come help me check the crawl space. I didn't tell him the real reason. I couldn't. He arrived an hour later with work lights and a crawling pad, and we spent the afternoon examining every inch of the space under my house. Found nothing, no cameras, no equipment, no signs that anyone or anything had been down there. But when we came back inside and Mike asked to use the bathroom, I checked my phone and found new photos. Images of us in the crawl space, taken from beneath the dirt. Our faces, distorted and strange, looking down as we searched. The photos showed us from underneath the ground itself, from a place that couldn't exist. Mike left, none the wiser, and I sat at my kitchen table trying to make sense of what was happening. I kept coming back to those photos from Gerald's camera, the images of him taken from below the ice. The final photo of his body floating, taken hours before he died. That's when I understood. Gerald hadn't been photographed by another person. He'd been photographed by the lake. By something in the lake, something that lived in that dark water beneath the ice, that could somehow operate a camera, that could create images from impossible angles. And now it was in my house, or under it, below my floors, in a space that shouldn't exist, taking photos the way it had taken photos of Gerald. I went back to my laptop and looked at those deleted photos from the memory card. They were still there. I deleted them twice, but they were back, filling up the folder like they'd never been removed. I scrolled through them again, looking for something I'd missed, some clue about what had taken them. In the background of the underwater photos, behind Gerald's boots and face and fishing rod, I could see shapes moving in the dark water. Not fish. The movement was wrong for fish. These shapes were larger, more deliberate, and in one photo, if I zoomed in enough, I could see what looked like a hand, pale and elongated, reaching up toward the ice. My phone clicked in my pocket. The camera sound, even though the phone was locked and in my jacket, I pulled it out and found another new photo. My kitchen table, photographed from below, and visible in the image, sitting at the table, was me. My face distorted by looking down, my eyes focused on my laptop screen. The timestamp showed it was taken 2 seconds ago. I looked down at the floor beneath my feet. Solid hardwood, the same floor that had been there when I bought the house 5 years ago. Nothing underneath but that crawl space we just searched. But something was down there now. Something that could take photos, that could move through spaces that shouldn't exist, that had followed me home from that estate sale. I should have left the camera in that tackle box, should have never looked at Gerald's photos, because now it knew I'd seen them, knew I'd witnessed what it had done to him. And for reasons I couldn't understand, it wanted me to see what it was doing now. The photos kept coming. Every few minutes, a new image. My floors from below, my ceilings from impossible angles. Sometimes I could see my own shadow in them. Sometimes I could see those shapes in the background, moving through space that physics said couldn't exist. I tried everything, called a priest, though I'm not religious. He blessed the house, sprinkled holy water, said prayers in Latin. The photos kept coming, called a paranormal investigator, who set up cameras and EMF detectors. His equipment recorded nothing, but my phone filled up with new images while he was there. Photos of him from below, his face distorted and strange, looking down at his useless instruments. I moved out for a week, stayed at a motel, left my phone behind. When I came back, the phone had 3,000 photos on it. A week's worth of images, one every few minutes, showing an empty house photographed from below. The images had a waiting quality to them, like something patient and eternal documenting the absence, marking time until I returned. I'm still in the house. Where else would I go? It's not confined to this place. I know that now. It's connected to me somehow, bound by the act of seeing those photos, of witnessing what it did to Gerald. My phone is filled with images taken from impossible places. My laptop shows me photos that shouldn't exist. Even my old Polaroid camera, the one I haven't used in years, spits out new photos sometimes. Always the same perspective, always from below, looking up. Last week, I saw Gerald's daughter at the grocery store. I almost didn't recognize her, but something made me look twice, and I realized it was her. I wanted to ask her about the camera, about the other items from the estate sale, about whether anyone else had experienced what I was experiencing. But she looked right through me, her eyes unfocused and strange, and I noticed she was holding her phone at an odd angle, pointing it down at the floor as she walked, like she was photographing something beneath her feet. I checked my phone later that night and found a new photo I hadn't taken. It showed the grocery store from below, the floor tiles and the fluorescent lights beyond. And visible in the frame, distorted by the angle, were 2 pairs of feet, mine and hers. Standing close together, both of us photographed from underneath, both of us connected now to whatever lives in those spaces below. I think about Gerald's final photo a lot. His body floating in the dark water, photographed 3 hours before he died. I wonder if he knew. If he'd been receiving photos too, images of himself taken from below the ice, warnings of what was coming. I wonder if he went out on that lake knowing he wouldn't come back, or if he was surprised when the ice gave way beneath him. My phone just clicked again. I don't need to check it to know what the photo shows. My ceiling, my floor from below. The space I occupy, documented by something that exists in the gaps, in the places that shouldn't be there. It's patient. It's always been patient. It waited for Gerald in the dark water beneath the ice. And now it's waiting for me, photographing from below, taking pictures of my life from an angle that means only one thing. It's measuring the distance, calculating the moment, preparing for the time when I'll join Gerald in those final photos, taken from below, time-stamped hours before I die. The camera is still in my garage, in that tackle box. Sometimes I think about throwing it in the lake, letting it sink down to where Gerald drowned, but I know it wouldn't matter. The photos would keep coming. They always do. Click. My phone just took another picture. I don't need to look to know what it shows. The hot springs near Radium were closed for 2 weeks in January, without any public explanation, and I worked maintenance there, so I knew the real reason. Management put out a statement about routine maintenance and water quality testing, the kind of vague corporate language that doesn't mean anything but keeps people from asking too many questions. But those of us on staff knew better. We knew what had started happening in the deep pool, and we knew that no amount of draining or cleaning or testing was going to fix it. It started with a guest complaint on a Tuesday morning. I was checking the chlorine levels in the shallow pool when Darlene from the front desk came to find me, her face tight with that particular expression she got when dealing with difficult customers. She said a woman was insisting she'd seen something in the deep pool, something that didn't make sense, and could I come talk to her because she was getting upset and Darlene didn't know what to say. The guest was in her 50s, well-dressed, the kind of person who came to the hot springs for relaxation and expected a certain level of service. She was wrapped in a robe by the poolside, still dripping, and she looked genuinely shaken. Not angry or demanding, just frightened in a way that seemed real. She told me she'd been doing laps in the deep pool, the one we kept at 103 degrees, when she'd seen someone sitting at the bottom. I asked her what she meant, and she described it carefully, like she was trying to convince herself as much as me. A person, she said, sitting cross-legged on the tiles at the deepest point, about 12 feet down. Perfectly still, not floating or swimming, just sitting there like it was the most natural thing in the world. She'd surfaced immediately, looked around for a lifeguard, looked back down to see if the person was in trouble. But from that angle, she couldn't see them anymore. She swam to a different spot, looked again, and there they were. Same position, same spot. She got out of the pool and came straight to the desk. I thanked her, assured her we'd look into it, gave her a voucher for a free visit. Standard procedure for complaints. Then I went to check the pool myself, already running through the likely explanations. Shadow from the skylight maybe, or a trick of the refraction. The water in the hot springs was mineral-rich, slightly cloudy, and sometimes it could play tricks on your eyes. But when I looked down into the deep pool from the edge, I saw it too. Just for a moment, from a specific angle, there was definitely a dark shape at the bottom. Human-sized, human-shaped, in what could have been a sitting position. I moved a few feet to the left, looked again, nothing. Moved back to where I'd been standing. There it was again, clear as day. I got the pool net, the long pole we used for cleaning, and probed the bottom. Felt nothing but smooth tile. The shape remained visible from that one angle, but the pole passed right through where it should have been. I called my supervisor, Frank, who'd been running the facility for 15 years. He came down, looked where I was pointing, and went pale. We cleared the pool immediately, told the few guests who were there that we'd detected a chemical imbalance and needed to do emergency maintenance. Frank called the head of operations, and within an hour, we had approval to drain the deep pool. It took most of the night, that big pump chugging away, lowering the water level inch by inch, while Frank and I waited and watched. When the pool was finally empty, we went down into it with flashlights and examined every tile, every drain, every surface. Found nothing. No debris, no staining, no explanation for what multiple people had seen. The tiles were clean, the grout was intact, the pool was completely normal. We filled it back up, ran the tests, and reopened it the next morning. By noon, we'd had 3 more reports. Different guests, all describing the same thing. A figure at the bottom of the pool, sitting cross-legged, visible only from certain angles. Always in the exact same spot, always in the exact same position. One guest, a local man who came to the springs every week, told me he'd seen it before. Months ago, he said, but he'd thought it was just the minerals in the water, his eyes playing tricks. Now he wasn't sure. Frank made the decision to install cameras. We brought in an underwater camera system, the kind used for pool inspections, and set it up to record the deep pool continuously. 4 angles, high resolution, recording to a hard drive in the maintenance office. If there was something down there, something we were missing, the cameras would catch it. I was the one who reviewed the first 24 hours of footage, sat in that cramped office, watching hours of empty pool on fast forward, mineral-rich water rippling under the lights. Nothing, just water and tiles and the occasional swimmer passing through the frame. But then I noticed something in the timestamp. Every hour, at exactly 17 minutes past, there was a single frame that looked different. Just one frame out of the thousands recorded each hour. I went back and isolated those frames. At 1:17, 2:17, 3:17, and so on, the camera would capture 1 second of footage that showed a dark silhouette at the bottom of the pool, human-shaped, sitting cross-legged, exactly where the guests had reported seeing it. 1 second, 1 frame per hour, so brief that you'd miss it if you weren't looking for it, but unmistakably there. I showed Frank, and he stared at that screen for a long time without saying anything. Then he made a call to management, and they made the decision to close the facility. They said 2 weeks, said they'd bring in specialists, structural engineers, water quality experts, but I knew they were stalling, trying to figure out what to do about something that didn't make any logical sense. We drained the pool again. This time we brought in equipment, ground-penetrating radar to check for voids or tunnels beneath the pool, electromagnetic sensors to detect any anomalies. Spent 3 days going over every inch of that pool and found absolutely nothing. The pool was solid, the ground beneath it was stable. There was no explanation for what the cameras were recording. That's when Terry volunteered to dive. Terry was one of the younger maintenance guys, early 20s, the type who'd grown up cliff diving and doing stupid stunts for attention. He said he'd go down during the refill, when the water was only a few feet deep, see if he could spot anything from below that we were missing from above. Frank didn't like the idea, but Terry was insistent, and honestly we were desperate for any kind of answer. We started the refill at 9 in the morning. When the water reached about 4 feet, Terry stripped down to his swim trunks and waded in. He had a waterproof flashlight and a GoPro strapped to his head. Frank and I watched from the edge, along with 2 other staff members. The water was already warm, steam rising off the surface as it poured in from the pipes. Terry duck dived down, the GoPro light visible through the clear water, and examined the bottom tiles. He surfaced, said everything looked normal, dove again. He did this maybe 5 or 6 times, checking different areas, running his hands over the tiles, looking for any irregularities. Then, on his 7th dive, he went down and didn't come back up. I was timing it with my watch. 30 seconds, which was longer than his previous dives but not alarming yet. 45 seconds. I leaned over the edge, trying to see him through the water. The GoPro light was still on, still at the bottom, but it wasn't moving. 1 minute. Frank yelled Terry's name. The light stayed motionless. Frank and I both jumped in, and the other guys ran for the emergency equipment. The water was only chest deep on me, but I had to dive to reach Terry. I grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled, and he was heavy, limp, not helping at all. Frank got his other side, and we hauled him to the surface. Terry wasn't breathing. His eyes were half open, rolled back, his skin already taking on a bluish tint. We got him out of the pool, started CPR while someone called 911. I was doing chest compressions, counting in my head, feeling his ribs flex under my palms, when he suddenly gasped, and his eyes flew open. He started thrashing, fighting us, shouting something I couldn't understand. We had to hold him down until the paramedics arrived, and even then he was agitated, confused, kept trying to get back to the pool. They loaded him into the ambulance, and I rode along because Frank needed to stay and deal with the facility. At the hospital, after they'd stabilized him and run their tests, Terry finally calmed down enough to talk. I was sitting in the chair next to his bed when he grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and said, "It grabbed my ankle. It asked me to stay." I asked him what he meant, who grabbed him, but he just shook his head. He said he'd been examining the tiles at the bottom when he felt a hand close around his ankle. A cold hand, he said, even though the water was 103 degrees. He tried to pull away, tried to kick free, but the grip was too strong. And then he heard a voice, not with his ears but in his head, asking him to stay. Just stay. Sit down at the bottom and stay. He said he'd started to do it, started to cross his legs and settle down onto the tiles, even though part of his mind was screaming that this was wrong, that he needed to breathe, that he was drowning. He would have done it, he said, if we hadn't pulled him out. The doctors found a bruise on his ankle, a handprint, clear as day, 5 fingers wrapped around his lower leg, purple and black against his skin, the kind of deep tissue bruising that takes significant pressure to create. But the water temperature had been 103 degrees, and I knew from my first aid training that heat doesn't cause bruising like that. Heat causes burns, causes swelling, but not the kind of precise contusion that looked exactly like someone had grabbed him hard enough to leave marks. Terry checked himself out of the hospital the next day against medical advice. Didn't come back to work. I heard later that he'd moved to Calgary, wouldn't talk about what happened, refused to even drive past the hot springs when he came back to visit family. The facility stayed closed. Management brought in more experts, people who specialized in unexplained phenomena, though they never called it that officially. One group wanted to fill the pool with concrete, seal it permanently. Another suggested leaving it drained indefinitely. But the hot springs were a major tourist draw for Radium, brought in revenue that the town depended on, and there was pressure to reopen. I quit before they made a final decision. I couldn't work there anymore. Couldn't walk past that pool without thinking about Terry's face when he woke up. That mixture of terror and relief. Couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. It asked me to stay. But I still live in Radium, and I hear things. They reopened the pool 3 months later after installing a shallow false floor at 8 feet, making it impossible to reach the spot where the figure appeared. Guests still report seeing it sometimes. A shadow visible through the grating of the false floor, still sitting cross-legged in the space below that no one can reach anymore. The cameras still record that 1 frame per hour at 17 minutes past, showing the silhouette in the sealed-off section. And sometimes, late at night, the staff who work the closing shift report hearing knocking from below the pool, rhythmic knocking, like someone tapping on the underside of the false floor, like something down there in that hot, mineral-rich water, sitting in the dark, waiting patiently for the barriers to fail. I think about Terry's bruise a lot, about how a handprint could form in water too hot for human touch, how a voice could speak without sound, how something could grab onto you from a place that sensors and cameras and structural engineers swore was empty. I think about that guest who first reported it, how calm the figure had seemed, how still, just sitting there at the bottom, patient and eternal. Last week I drove past the facility and saw the parking lot was full, tourists and locals enjoying the springs like nothing had ever happened. I wanted to stop, wanted to warn them somehow, but what would I say? That something lives at the bottom of the deep pool, something that asks you to stay? They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I am. But sometimes, when I'm in my own bathroom, running a hot shower or filling the tub, I think about that voice Terry described, the one that asked him to stay. And I wonder if it's limited to that one pool, or if it lives in all hot water, in all those places where heat and minerals and depth combine to create spaces we don't fully understand. I wonder if it's patient enough to wait in smaller spaces, in bathtubs and showers and hot tubs, in any body of heated water where someone might close their eyes and sink down, just for a moment, just to relax. I take cold showers now, always cold, and I never, ever put my head under, because I know what lives at the bottom of hot, dark water. I know it's still there, sitting cross-legged, waiting at 17 minutes past every hour for someone to join it, still asking, in that voice that bypasses ears and speaks directly to some deeper part of you, just stay. Just sit down and stay. And the terrible thing is, part of me understands why Terry almost did it. Why someone would want to sink down into that heat, cross their legs, and finally rest. The voice makes it sound so simple, so peaceful. That's how I know it's still there. Because sometimes, late at night, when I'm tired and worn down and the world feels too heavy, I can almost hear it myself. Not in my bathroom or my shower, but somewhere deeper. Somewhere in the back of my mind where that kind of darkness lives. Asking me, always asking, won't you stay? I'm a ham radio operator, and in February I picked up a transmission that still haunts me. I've been running my station out of my basement in Prince George for almost 15 years now, mostly talking to other operators across Canada and the northern US, doing weather relay during storms, occasionally helping with emergency communications. It's a quiet hobby, the kind of thing that keeps me company during the long winter nights when the darkness settles in at 4 in the afternoon and doesn't lift until 8 the next morning. The night I picked up the transmission was a Tuesday, February 19th. I remember the date because I'd marked it in my log, the way I always do, noting atmospheric conditions and signal strength. It was cold outside, maybe -25, but clear. Stars visible through my basement window, that particular kind of brittle clarity you only get in deep winter. I was scanning the frequencies around 9 p.m., listening to the usual chatter, when I caught something on 7.255 megahertzes. A voice, male, describing weather conditions. That wasn't unusual. Lots of operators relay weather information, especially during winter, when conditions can change fast and dangerous. But something about this transmission felt off from the first words. The voice was too calm, too measured, like someone reading from a script they'd memorized perfectly. There was no emotion in it, no sense of urgency, even though the conditions being described were severe. Whiteout conditions developing east of Telegraph Creek, the voice said. Visibility less than 10 meters. Snow accumulation rate approximately 8 centimeters per hour. Wind speeds gusting to 70 kilometers per hour from the northwest. Drifts forming across Highway 37. Travel not advised. I adjusted my receiver, trying to get a clearer signal. Telegraph Creek was about 500 kilometers northwest of Prince George, a small community near the Stikine River. Remote country, the kind of place where a bad storm could cut you off for days or weeks. The transmission was coming through clearly despite the distance, which was unusual. I'd need pretty good atmospheric conditions to receive that strongly from that far away. Ground blizzard conditions, the voice continued in that same flat mechanical tone. Temperature -32 degrees, wind chill -48, visibility 0 at road level. Multiple vehicles stranded on Highway 37 between Telegraph Creek and Dease Lake. I keyed my microphone, following protocol. Station calling conditions near Telegraph Creek. This is VE7, Quebec, Tango, Lima, in Prince George. What's your call sign? Over. Static for a moment. Then the voice came back, still in that same measured tone. VE7, November, Alpha Romeo. Broadcasting storm conditions, Telegraph Creek area. Over. I wrote down the call sign and reached for my laptop, pulling up the Canadian Amateur Radio Database, VE7NAR. I found it quickly enough, felt a cold prickle run down my spine when I read the details. The call sign was listed as inactive, last registered to a Thomas Martin Halverson of Telegraph Creek, British Columbia, status, deceased, date of death, the 19th of February 1983. 40 years ago to the day. I stared at the screen, my mind racing through explanations. Someone was using an old call sign, maybe as a tribute, or just because they didn't know it was inactive. That had to be it. But the date bothered me, that exact match to Halverson's death date. And when I searched for more information about him, I found a brief mention in an old newspaper article archived online. Thomas Halverson, amateur radio operator, died in a winter storm while attempting to help stranded motorists on Highway 37 near Telegraph Creek. His body was recovered 3 days later, frozen in his truck, radio still transmitting. I keyed the mic again, my hand not quite steady. VE7 NAR. This is VE7, QTL. I have you showing as an inactive call sign. Can you confirm your identification? Over. The silence stretched longer this time, long enough that I thought I'd lost the signal. Then his voice came back, and there was something different in it now. Not emotion exactly, but a quality I hadn't noticed before. An echo, maybe, or a hollowness that made the words sound like they were coming from somewhere far away. Call sign VE7, November, Alpha, Romeo, he said slowly. Thomas Halverson, Telegraph Creek. I know it's inactive. I know I died in 1983. I've known for 40 years. My throat went dry. This had to be someone's idea of a sick joke. Someone who knew the story, who'd looked up the old call sign and decided to mess with people on the anniversary. But the voice didn't sound like someone playing a prank. It sounded empty, resigned. I don't understand, I said, abandoning radio protocol. What are you? I've been broadcasting the same storm for 40 years. The voice interrupted. Every year on February 19th, I come back on the air. I describe the conditions. I warn people. I've been doing it since the night I died. Can you see it yet? I looked toward my basement window. Clear sky. Stars. The security light in my backyard illuminating fresh snow that hadn't been touched since the last fall 3 days ago. See what? There's no storm here. It's clear. Not yet, he said, but it's coming. It follows the broadcast. It's always followed the broadcast. As he spoke, I noticed my breath starting to fog in front of my face. That was wrong. My basement was heated, kept at a comfortable 20 degrees. But now I could see my breath, small white puffs in the air. I glanced at the thermostat on the wall. 18 degrees, dropping as I watched. What do you mean it follows the broadcast? I asked, my voice tight. Static crackled for a long moment. When he spoke again, there was something in his voice that might have been regret, might have been sorrow, if a voice that hollow could still feel such things. The storm I died in, he said. I was broadcasting conditions, trying to warn people, trying to help. I kept transmitting right up until the end. Kept describing what I was seeing, the whiteout, the cold, the way the snow just erased everything. And when I died, the broadcast didn't stop. It just kept going. And the storm, that same storm, it kept going too. Every year it comes back. Every year I broadcast, and every year the storm follows the transmission to whoever's listening. I stood up, nearly knocking over my chair. The temperature was still dropping, 15 degrees now. I could hear my furnace running full blast, could feel the warm air coming from the vents, but the cold was winning. My windows were starting to frost over from the inside. That's not possible, I said, but I was already moving toward the stairs, toward the main floor where I could see outside, could confirm that this was just some kind of equipment malfunction, some bizarre coincidence. I'm sorry I responded to you. His voice continued through the speaker. I try not to answer anymore, try to just broadcast and sign off, but sometimes I forget. Sometimes I remember what it was like to talk to another operator, to have a conversation, and I respond before I remember what it costs. I reached the main floor, ran to the living room window. The sky was still clear, but as I watched, I saw the first stars begin to disappear. Not clouds moving in, not the gradual approach of a weather front. The stars just vanished, blinked out like someone was erasing them one by one, and in their place, snow began to fall. It came down fast, faster than any natural snow I'd ever seen. Within seconds, the visibility dropped from clear to whiteout, the security light in my neighbor's yard disappearing behind a wall of white. The wind picked up, and I could hear it screaming around my house, that particular shriek that only comes in the worst blizzards. I ran back to the basement, grabbed the mic. How do I stop it? How do I make it stop? His voice came back through layers of static that seemed to be getting worse. You can't stop it. The broadcast brought it to you. It'll blow itself out in a few hours, maybe a day. It always does. But it'll be bad. The same storm that killed me, playing out again. People will get stranded. Some of them won't make it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Why does it keep happening? I demanded. Why are you still broadcasting? Because I can't stop, he said. And for the first time, there was real emotion in his voice. Pain. Desperation. I died with the mic keyed. Died while I was transmitting. And now I'm stuck in that moment, forever broadcasting the storm that killed me. Every year, every February 19th, at the exact time I died, 9:47 p.m., and every year the storm comes back with me. I looked at my watch, 9:43, 4 minutes until what? Until he died again? Until the broadcast ended? They found me 3 days later, he continued, in my truck, frozen solid, radio still transmitting static. They said I must have been trying to call for help until the very end. But I wasn't calling for help. I was broadcasting conditions, trying to warn people. That's all I ever wanted to do. The lights in my house flickered. I could hear the wind outside getting worse. Could hear something hitting the siding. Tree branches maybe, or just the force of the wind driving the snow horizontally. My phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Severe winter storm warning. Whiteout conditions. Travel not advised. The same warnings he'd been broadcasting. Thomas, I said, using his name for the first time. Is there anything I can do? Any way to help you? Silence. Long enough that I thought the transmission had cut out. Then, remember my name. That's all. Just remember that I tried to help, that I died trying to warn people. Sometimes I forget myself. Sometimes all I remember is the storm and the cold and the fear. But if someone remembers my name, remembers what I was trying to do, maybe that's enough. The clock on my radio clicked over to 9:47. The transmission cut out mid-word, replaced by dead air. Not static, not the sound of an empty frequency. Just silence, absolute and complete. I sat there in my basement, listening to nothing, feeling the temperature continue to drop despite the furnace's best efforts. The storm raged for 18 hours. It was one of the worst winter storms to hit the region in decades, meteorologists said afterward. They couldn't explain where it had come from, how it had developed so quickly with no warning. The forecast had called for clear skies, but the storm had materialized anyway, dumping over 70 centimeters of snow, creating drifts 3 meters high, stranding hundreds of vehicles. 3 people died. 2 motorists caught on the highway when the whiteout hit, and an elderly man who had a heart attack trying to shovel his driveway. I listened to the news reports with a growing sense of guilt, knowing that somehow my response to that broadcast had brought this storm to my area, that Thomas Halverson's 40-year-old death had reached out and claimed 3 more victims. During the height of the storm, around 2 in the morning, I was standing at my living room window watching the snow when I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, cutting through the shriek of the wind. The same measured, mechanical tone, describing conditions. Whiteout, drifts, temperature dropping. I pressed my face to the glass, trying to see through the wall of white, and I swear I saw a figure out there. Just for a moment, barely visible through the storm. Someone standing in the snow, speaking into a radio, describing the storm that was killing him all over again. The storm ended around noon the next day, breaking up as suddenly as it had arrived. The sun came out, the temperature warmed, and crews started clearing the roads. Life went back to normal with that strange resilience people in northern climates develop. We'd survived another winter storm. That's what people do up here. But I couldn't let it go. I researched Thomas Halverson, found what little information existed about him. He'd been 43 when he died, a long-time ham radio operator who'd provided weather relay and emergency communications for the Telegraph Creek area. On the night of the 19th of February 1983, he'd received a call from a stranded motorist and had gone out to help despite the worsening conditions. His truck was found 3 days later, buried in a drift, with Halverson frozen behind the wheel. His radio was still on, still transmitting static on his usual frequency. I found his daughter through an online search, sent her a carefully worded message asking if she'd be willing to talk about her father. She called me the next day, her voice warm despite the topic. She said she was glad someone still remembered him, that most people from that time were gone now, and few people knew the story anymore. I told her about the broadcast, though I left out the impossible parts. Just said I'd picked up a transmission using her father's old call sign, someone describing storm conditions near Telegraph Creek. I asked if she knew anything about it, if maybe someone was honoring his memory. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You heard it on February 19th, didn't you?" My blood went cold. "Yes. How did you—" "You're not the first," she said softly. "Every few years I get a call from someone who picked up a transmission on that date. Always the same thing. A voice describing a winter storm, using my father's call sign. And always, there's a storm that follows. I don't know how to explain it. I've stopped trying. I just know that he's still out there somehow, still trying to warn people, still trying to help." "Do you believe that?" I asked. "That it's really him?" "I don't know what I believe anymore," she said. "But I know he never stopped transmitting that night. They said the radio was still on when they found him, still broadcasting. And I think maybe some part of him is still doing that, still trying to save people, even though he couldn't save himself." We talked for another hour. She told me about her father, about how dedicated he'd been to his radio work, how he'd seen it as a public service, a way to help people in an area with limited communication infrastructure. She said he'd always taken his responsibilities seriously, had always been the first to respond during emergencies. "Thank you for remembering him," she said before we hung up, "for knowing his name. I think he'd appreciate that. I still operate my radio station, still scan the frequencies on winter nights, but I avoid 7.255 megahertzes on February 19th. I don't want to pick up that transmission again, don't want to be responsible for bringing that storm to another community. 3 people died because I answered, because I acknowledged Thomas Halverson's broadcast and allowed the storm to follow it to me. But sometimes on other nights, on different frequencies, I think I hear echoes of his voice, that same measured tone, describing conditions somewhere, warning people, trying to help, the way he always tried to help. And I wonder how many others are out there like him, caught in their final moments, repeating their last acts forever. I keep his call sign written in my logbook, VE7NAR, Thomas Halverson, Telegraph Creek, died the 19th of February, 1983, trying to save others. His daughter was right. He does deserve to be remembered, even if that memory comes with the knowledge that every year, on the anniversary of his death, he broadcasts the storm that killed him to anyone who listens. And every year, the storm follows the broadcast. I just hope no one else is listening. Government work sent me to conduct a snow survey in the backcountry near Dease Lake in early March. It was contract work, the kind of job that pays well, because most people don't want to spend 2 weeks alone in the bush taking measurements in temperatures that regularly drop below -30. But I'd done surveys before, had the training and the equipment, and the isolation didn't bother me, or so I thought. The job was straightforward enough. I was to establish a survey line running east from Dease Lake into Crown Land, taking snow depth and density measurements every 100 meters, collecting data the provincial government used for spring runoff predictions and watershed management. They'd drop me at a staging area with a snowmobile, camping gear, and enough supplies for 3 weeks. The survey route was marked on my GPS, a straight line cutting through dense boreal forest for about 40 kilometers. Standard procedure was to make camp every night, work during daylight, mark my progress, and move on. The first 2 days went fine. The snow was deep, over a meter in most places, and the forest was that particular kind of quiet you only get in deep winter wilderness. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my snowshoes crunching through the crust and my own breathing. I'd make my measurements, record the data in my field notebook, mark the location on my GPS, and move on to the next point. By the second night, I'd covered about 8 kilometers, right on schedule. On the morning of day 3, I found the first set of tracks. I was heading toward my next survey point, following my GPS through a stand of black spruce, when I saw boot prints in the snow ahead of me. That wasn't entirely unusual. These were crown lands, open to trappers and hunters, and I knew there were a few people who worked lines in this area, but something about the prints made me stop and look closer. They were fresh, made within the last few hours judging by how clean the edges were, and they matched my boots exactly. Same tread pattern, same size, even the same wear spot on the left heel where I'd scuffed them on a rock years ago. I knelt down, compared my boot to the print, and felt a cold sensation in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was a perfect match. I told myself I must have gotten turned around somehow, that these were my tracks from earlier, even though I didn't remember coming this way. The GPS showed I was on course, but maybe I'd wandered off route without noticing. Maybe I'd gotten disoriented in the trees. It happens sometimes, even to experienced people. The forest could play tricks on your sense of direction. But the tracks were heading in a direction I definitely hadn't gone. They led northeast, off my survey line, toward an area I hadn't reached yet. Areas I wasn't scheduled to survey for another 4 or 5 days. I followed them for about 50 meters, just curious, just wanting to understand. They moved through the forest with purpose, not wandering or meandering, clearly heading toward a specific destination. Then I stopped, checked my GPS again, and decided I was wasting time. Whoever had made the tracks, whether it was somehow me in some moment of confusion I couldn't remember, or someone else who happened to have identical boots, it didn't matter. I had work to do. I went back to my survey line and continued my measurements. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling, and I kept an eye out for more tracks as I worked. I found them again at my next survey point. Fresh prints, my boots, heading off into the forest in a direction I hadn't gone. And again, at the point after that, always the same. My tracks, leading away from my survey line, going deeper into the forest. By the 4th day, I was starting to question my own memory. Had I been sleepwalking, getting up at night and wandering into the forest without remembering? But I was a light sleeper, and I would have noticed my boots being wet or my gear disturbed. And the tracks I was finding were being made during the day, while I was awake and working. I could tell by the way the snow had settled, by the slight melting at the edges that only happened when the sun hit them. On the 5th day, I decided to follow the tracks all the way. I'd reached a point in my survey where I was ahead of schedule, and my curiosity had turned into something more urgent. I needed to know where these tracks were going, what they were leading to. I needed to understand what was happening. I found the prints at my morning survey point, the same as always. Fresh tracks, my boots, heading northeast into dense forest. I marked my current location carefully on my GPS, made sure I could find my way back, and followed the tracks. They led me through terrain that got increasingly difficult. Thick stands of lodgepole pine where I had to duck under branches, across frozen creeks where the snow bridges made me nervous, up slopes that left me breathing hard. The tracks never hesitated, never showed signs of the person making them being tired or lost. They just moved forward with that same steady purpose. After about 2 kilometers, the tracks led me into a small clearing I hadn't known was there. It wasn't on my maps, wasn't marked on my GPS. Just a circular opening in the forest, maybe 30 meters across, with a snow shelter built against the base of a massive spruce tree on the far side. The shelter was well constructed, the kind of thing that takes experience to build properly. A quinzhee, hollowed out of a mound of packed snow, with a small entrance tunnel and ventilation hole. The tracks led directly to it. I approached slowly, calling out, not wanting to surprise whoever had built it. No response. Just the absolute silence of the winter forest. I knelt down and looked into the entrance tunnel. Inside the shelter, I could see equipment, survey equipment, a measuring rod, a density kit, a field notebook. My survey equipment. I pulled off my pack, checked the contents. Everything was there. My measuring rod, my density kit, my field notebook, all exactly where they should be. But inside that shelter was another complete set. Identical tools, same wear patterns, same modifications I'd made to the measuring rod to make it easier to read. I crawled into the shelter, my heart pounding, and picked up the field notebook. It was mine. My handwriting, my notation style, my survey data, except the dates were wrong. The entries started 3 days in the future and continued for a week beyond that. Survey points I hadn't reached yet, measurements I hadn't taken, observations I hadn't made. The handwriting was identical to mine. Not just similar, but perfect matches down to the way I crossed my sevens and the slight slant I gave to my capital letters. And the data was detailed, precise, exactly the kind of notes I would take. I flipped to the last page with writing on it. The date was 10 days ahead of today. The final entry described a survey point about 15 kilometers further northeast, well beyond where my route was supposed to take me. And at the bottom of the page, in my handwriting, was a single line: "Don't follow the tracks back." I sat there in that snow shelter, holding a notebook I'd written but hadn't written, looking at dates that hadn't happened yet, and felt reality start to bend around me. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. But the notebook was real, the equipment was real, and the tracks that had led me here were unmistakably mine. I needed to get back to my camp, needed to think, to figure out what was happening. I crawled out of the shelter and stood in the clearing, trying to orient myself. The tracks I'd followed to get here should have been visible, should have led back the way I'd come. But when I looked at the snow, my stomach dropped. The tracks were gone, not covered by new snow, not drifted over, just gone, like they'd never existed. And in their place was a different set of tracks, fresh prints, my boots, leading out of the clearing in a new direction, not back toward my survey line and my camp, deeper into the forest, heading northeast. I checked my GPS, trying to stay calm. The device showed my current location clearly, showed my camp about 2 kilometers to the southwest. I could navigate back, didn't need to follow any tracks. I started walking, keeping my eyes on the GPS, moving as directly as I could through the trees. But every time I looked down, I saw the tracks. My tracks, always ahead of me, always leading in a slightly different direction than I wanted to go. And no matter which direction I chose, I kept finding them. If I went west, I'd find my prints leading northwest. If I corrected south, I'd find them heading southwest. Always pulling me off course, always leading me deeper into the forest. By the time the sun started to set, I was lost. The GPS showed I'd been moving in circles, looping back on myself, covering the same ground over and over, even though I'd been trying to walk in a straight line. I made camp in a small grove, got a fire going, tried to warm some food even though I had no appetite. The notebook from the shelter was in my pack, I kept taking it out, reading through the entries, looking for some clue about what was happening. The survey data was good. Better than good, it was exactly the kind of information I'd come here to collect. The measurements were precise, the observations detailed. Whoever had written this, whether it was some future version of me or something else entirely, they knew what they were doing. And the route they'd surveyed went far beyond where I was supposed to go, into areas I'd never heard of, toward locations that weren't on any map. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, watching the darkness between the trees, listening for sounds that never came. And in the morning, when I packed up my camp, I found fresh tracks leading away from my fire pit. My tracks, made while I'd been sitting there awake all night, made by boots I'd been wearing, in snow I'd been watching. The tracks led deeper into the forest, northeast, always northeast, following the route described in that impossible notebook. And when I tried to go a different direction, tried to head back toward the staging area and civilization, I'd find myself somehow circling back, finding those tracks again, following them despite every intention not to. I've been out here for 3 weeks now, maybe longer. I've lost track of the days. The notebook shows I have 7 more survey points to complete, 7 more measurements to take before the route ends. I've been taking them, recording the data, following the tracks that are somehow my own, because what else can I do? Every time I try to leave, I end up back on this path. Every time I try to call for help on my satellite phone, the call won't connect. Every time I check my GPS, it shows me deeper into the wilderness, further from anywhere I should be. The tracks keep appearing ahead of me, fresh every morning, leading to the next survey point. And sometimes at night, I hear sounds in the forest. The crunch of boots in snow, moving around my camp. The scratch of pencil on paper, like someone recording data. The mechanical click of a measuring rod being extended and collapsed. But I'm alone. I'm always alone. I found another shelter yesterday. Same construction, same equipment, another notebook with my handwriting, with dates even further ahead. This one ends a month from now. The final entry describes a survey point somewhere deep in the wilderness, a place that doesn't exist on any map. And at the bottom, don't stop. You can't stop until you reach the end. I don't know what happens when I reach the end. I don't know if there is an end, or if I'll just keep finding notebooks with dates further and further ahead, keep following tracks that lead deeper and deeper into the forest. I don't know if I'm still in the real world, or if I've slipped into something else, some pocket of time or space that doesn't follow normal rules. But I know I can't go back. The tracks only lead forward. And somewhere ahead of me, some version of me that's already walked this path, that's already taken these measurements, is leaving messages I don't fully understand. Warnings I can't follow because the only way out is through. I'm writing this in my notebook, the real one, the one I brought with me. Tomorrow I'll probably find it in a snow shelter, along with all my other equipment, dated 3 days ahead. And I'll keep walking, keep following the tracks, keep taking measurements that someone or something needs me to take. If anyone finds this, if these notebooks somehow make it back to civilization, know that the survey data is accurate. Whatever else is happening, the measurements are good. The government will get what they paid for, even if I never make it back to tell them how I got it. The tracks are waiting. They're always waiting. And tomorrow, I'll follow them again because there's nothing else I can do. Deep into the forest, toward an end I can't see, following footprints I've already made in a future I haven't reached yet. The snow remembers where I'm going, even if I don't. Every winter, locals in the neighborhoods around Boundary Bay reported seeing a swimmer in the frigid water, despite temperatures that would kill most people in minutes. I'd heard the stories for years, dismissed them as urban legend or mistaken sightings of seals or debris. But I saw him myself on a gray January morning, and I wish to God I hadn't. I'd taken up walking the beach path as part of my New Year's resolution to get more exercise. The path runs along the eastern shore of Boundary Bay, just south of Vancouver, and in winter it's usually deserted except for the occasional dog walker or bird watcher. That morning was particularly cold, maybe 2 or 3 degrees above freezing, with a wind coming off the Strait of Georgia that cut right through my jacket. The water looked like hammered steel under the overcast sky, gray and lifeless and absolutely uninviting. I'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when I saw movement in the water. At first I thought it was a seal. We got them sometimes in the bay, but the movement was wrong. Too regular, too rhythmic. I stopped and stared, and that's when I realized I was watching someone swim. He was maybe 30 meters from shore, moving parallel to the beach with steady, practiced strokes. Front crawl. His form was actually quite good, the kind of technique that comes from years of training. I stood there, frozen in disbelief, watching this person swimming in water that had to be around 4 degrees Celsius. Water that cold causes shock within seconds, hypothermia within minutes. Nobody should be out there, and certainly not swimming laps like they were in a heated pool. I moved closer to the water's edge, cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted, "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" The swimmer stopped immediately, his head coming up, his arms switching to a treading motion. Even from 30 meters away, I could see he was middle-aged, maybe late 40s, with dark hair plastered to his head. He was wearing a wetsuit, I thought at first, but as I looked closer, I realized it was just dark swim trunks and a rash guard. Not nearly enough protection for water this cold. "I'm calling for help," I yelled, already pulling out my phone. "Just hold on." "No," his voice carried clearly across the water, sharp with panic. "Don't call anyone. I'm fine." "You're not fine. You're going to die out there. The water's freezing." He was still treading water, and I could see him clearly now. His face was drawn, exhausted, with dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. But it was his expression that made my blood run cold. It wasn't the look of someone who was cold or tired or even in danger. It was the look of absolute bone-deep terror. "I can't stop," he said, his voice cracking. "If I stop, I sink, and I can't reach the bottom." I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he'd said. "What do you mean you sink? Everyone sinks if they stop swimming. Just head toward shore. I'll help you out." He shook his head violently, water spraying from his hair. "You don't understand. I've been swimming for 3 winters. 3 years. If I stop moving, I go down, and I can't find the bottom. I just keep sinking, and there's nothing below me, and I can't." His voice broke completely. "Please, please just go. Don't watch me. Don't call anyone." My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. This man was clearly in crisis, hypothermic and confused, and he needed help whether he wanted it or not. The operator answered, and I quickly explained the situation, giving my location along the beach path. There was a pause on the line. Then the operator said, in a tone that was far too calm, "Can you describe the swimmer, please?" "Middle-aged, Asian descent, dark hair, wearing dark swim trunks. He says he can't stop swimming or he'll sink. I think he's hypothermic. He's not making sense." Another pause, longer this time. I could hear the operator typing. "Sir, we're aware of this individual. He's been reported multiple times over the past 3 winters. We've sent boats out to assist, but he always disappears before they arrive." "What do you mean disappears?" "He dives under the water and doesn't resurface. We've searched the area extensively. We have dive teams, sonar equipment. There's never any sign of him." I looked back at the water. The swimmer had started moving again, his strokes mechanical and steady, like a machine that couldn't stop. "Then who is he? Have you identified him?" The operator's voice dropped, became almost reluctant. "We think it's Marcus Chen. He drowned in Boundary Bay in 2015, training for a winter triathlon. Went out for a practice swim one November morning and never came back. His body was never recovered." The phone felt heavy in my hand. "You think I'm seeing a ghost?" "I don't know what you're seeing, sir, but we've had this exact report 14 times in the last 3 years. Always in winter, always the same description, always the same location. And every time we send someone, he's gone before they arrive." I ended the call, my mind racing. This couldn't be real, couldn't be a ghost or a spirit or whatever the operator was implying. There had to be a rational explanation. Someone who looked like Marcus Chen, maybe someone who was mentally ill and had fixated on recreating his death, someone who needed help. I walked along the shore, keeping pace with the swimmer. He was still moving parallel to the beach, his strokes never varying, never slowing. I called out to him again. "Marcus? Is your name Marcus?" He stopped swimming, started treading water again, and the terror in his eyes intensified. "How do you know my name?" "They told me. Emergency services. They said you drowned here in 2015. "I did," he said simply. "I drowned. I went under and I couldn't find the surface. The water was so cold and so dark, and I kept trying to swim up, but there was no up. Just water, endless water. and I couldn't breathe, and then I couldn't fight anymore, and I died. He said it so matter-of-factly, with such certainty, that I felt goosebumps rise on my arms that had nothing to do with the cold. But you're here now. You're alive. Am I? He looked down at the water beneath him, and his face twisted into an expression of such horror that I took an involuntary step back. I don't think I am. I think I'm still down there, still sinking, still trying to find the bottom. But if I keep moving, if I keep swimming, I can stay near the surface. I can see the sky. I can pretend I'm alive. That doesn't make sense, I said, but my voice sounded weak even to my own ears. I know, he said. Believe me, I know. But every time I stop, every time I let myself sink, I go down into the dark and there's no bottom. Just cold and pressure and darkness that goes on forever. So I swim. I've been swimming for 3 years, 3 winters. I only appear in winter because that's when I died. That's when the water was cold enough to trap me. I wanted to argue, wanted to insist this was impossible, but something in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't lying or confused. He was telling me exactly what he believed to be true, and that belief was backed by a terror so profound it was almost tangible. What can I do? I asked. How can I help you? He laughed, a broken sound that was more sob than humor. You can't. Nobody can. The boats come and I have to hide. I dive down and I'm back in the dark, in the endless falling, and I have to fight my way back up every time. So I hide from them, dive when I hear their engines, wait until they're gone. Because being here, swimming on the surface, is the only peace I get. A Coast Guard boat was visible in the distance, heading toward us. The 911 operator must have dispatched it, despite what they'd told me. Marcus saw it too, and the terror in his eyes transformed into something closer to panic. I have to go, he said. I can't let them catch me. If they pull me out, I'll die again. I'll fall into that darkness, and this time I won't be able to fight back up. Wait, I said. Maybe they can help. Maybe they can. But he was already diving, his body slipping beneath the surface with practiced ease. I ran to the water's edge, staring down into the murky depths, but I couldn't see him. The Coast Guard boat arrived a few minutes later, and the crew asked me to describe what I'd seen. I told them everything, and they nodded with the weary recognition of people who'd heard this story before. They searched for an hour, crisscrossing the bay with sonar, diving at the location where I'd seen him go under. Found nothing. The water was only about 8 meters deep at that point, they told me. If someone had drowned there, if a body was on the bottom, they would have found it. But there was nothing, just sand and silt and the occasional crab. I started coming back to the beach path regularly after that. Not every day, but a few times a week, always in the early morning. I told myself I was just maintaining my exercise routine, but really I was looking for him. Looking for Marcus, for the swimmer who couldn't stop. I saw him 3 more times over the next month. Always in the same area, always swimming with those same steady strokes, always parallel to shore. I stopped trying to call for help. Instead, I'd just walk alongside him, and sometimes he'd stop and tread water, and we'd talk. He told me about his life before he drowned, about his wife and 2 daughters, about the triathlon he'd been training for, about how much he'd loved winter swimming despite the cold. He said the cold made him feel alive, made every sensation sharp and real. He laughed bitterly when he said that, given where it had gotten him. He told me what it was like in the water below, how it wasn't just darkness but an absence, a void that pulled at him constantly, how the pressure increased the deeper he sank but never enough to crush him, just enough to hurt, to remind him that he was falling through something that had no end, how he could still feel the need to breathe even though he was already dead, could feel his lungs burning even though they'd stopped working years ago. The worst part, he said during our last conversation, is that I can see them sometimes. My family. They're standing on the shore and they can't see me. My daughters grew up. One of them's in college now. I saw her walking the beach path last year with her boyfriend, and she walked right past me, right past where I was swimming, and she didn't see me, didn't know I was there. I'm sorry, I said, because what else could I say? He looked down into the water beneath him, and I saw that expression of horror across his face again. There's something down there, he whispered. Something in the deep. I've seen it when I sink. It's waiting for me. It knows I can't swim forever. What is it? I don't know. I don't want to know, but it's patient. And every time I go down, it's a little closer. One day I won't be able to fight back up. One day I'll be too tired and I'll sink all the way down and it'll have me. That was the last time I saw him. I came back to the beach the next morning and the morning after that, but he wasn't there. I asked other regular walkers if they'd seen him, described him carefully, but nobody had. The Coast Guard told me there had been no reports for 3 weeks, which was unusual. Normally they got at least one call a week during winter. I'm still walking the beach path. It's April now, the water's warming up, and I know I won't see him until next winter if I see him at all. But I think about him constantly. Think about what he said about something waiting in the deep, about being too tired to fight back up. And sometimes, on particularly gray mornings, when the water looks like hammered steel and the wind cuts through my jacket, I stand at the water's edge and look out at the bay. I watch for movement, for steady strokes parallel to shore, for a middle-aged man trapped between drowning and swimming forever. I never see him, but sometimes I think I see other swimmers. Different people in different areas of the bay, all moving with that same mechanical rhythm, all swimming parallel to shore like they're trapped in invisible lanes. And I wonder if Marcus was the only one. If the bay has collected others over the years, other people who drowned and couldn't find the bottom, who chose endless swimming over facing whatever waits in the deep. The locals say the bay has always been dangerous. Strong currents, cold water, sudden drop-offs. They say people have been drowning here since before the city was built. They say on quiet mornings you can sometimes hear voices calling for help from the water, but when you look, there's nobody there. I believe them now. I believe all of it, because I've seen Marcus Chen swimming in water that should have killed him, seen the terror in his eyes when he looks down into the depths, seen him dive beneath the surface to hide from rescue. And I know that somewhere below, in water that's only 8 meters deep but somehow contains an abyss, something is waiting. Something patient and hungry and inevitable. Waiting for the day when Marcus gets too tired to keep swimming. When all of them get too tired, I don't swim anymore. I don't even wade in the bay, not even on the hottest summer days. Because I've seen what the water takes, and I know it doesn't always let go. If you walk the beach path around Boundary Bay in winter, and you see someone swimming parallel to shore, don't call for help. Don't try to rescue them. Just keep walking. They're not swimming by choice, but they're choosing to swim rather than face the alternative. And trust me, you don't want to know what the alternative is. I've seen it reflected in Marcus Chen's eyes when he looks down into the water beneath him. Some depths shouldn't be measured, some bottoms shouldn't be reached, and some people should never stop swimming. The warming hut near the summit of Mount Seymour is basic, the kind of minimal shelter that's only meant to keep you alive long enough for the weather to clear. 4 walls, a slanted roof, a single bench along the back wall, and a logbook chained to a small shelf where hikers could record their passage. I'd hiked Seymour dozens of times over the years, knew every switchback and false summit, but I'd never actually used the warming hut until that January afternoon when the storm came in faster than the forecast had predicted. I'd started the hike at noon under partly cloudy skies, planning to summit and be back down before dark. But winter weather in the coast mountains doesn't care about your plans. By 2 o'clock, the clouds had closed in completely. The temperature had dropped 10 degrees, and snow was falling so thick I could barely see 10 meters ahead. I was still an hour from the summit when I realized I needed to find shelter and wait it out. The warming hut appeared through the whiteout like a gift, its dark wooden walls barely visible against the snow. I pushed through the door, grateful to be out of the wind, and stopped short. I wasn't alone. An elderly woman sat on the bench, her hands folded in her lap, looking at me with a gentle smile. She was dressed in hiking gear that looked decades out of date: wool pants, a heavy parka with an orange stripe that screamed 1970s, leather boots that were scuffed and worn but well maintained. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her face had that weathered quality of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. "Hello," she said, her voice warm and friendly. "Terrible storm, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said, still catching my breath, brushing snow from my jacket. "Came out of nowhere. I didn't think anyone else would be up here in this weather." "Oh, I'm just waiting for my husband," she said, that smile never wavering. "He went ahead to check the trail conditions. He'll be back soon." I sat down on the opposite end of the bench, grateful for the respite. The hut was cold, barely warmer than outside, but at least it blocked the wind. "How long have you been waiting?" "Not long," she said. "Maybe an hour. He's very experienced, knows these mountains like the back of his hand. I'm sure he'll return any minute." Something about the way she said it made me uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was how calm she seemed, how unconcerned about being separated from her husband in a whiteout. Or maybe it was the gear. That orange striped parka looked like something from a catalog 40 years old. "You must be cold," I said. "Do you want some hot tea? I have a thermos." "That's very kind, but no thank you. I'm fine, just waiting." I pulled out my thermos anyway, poured myself some tea, and tried to make conversation. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and I figured I'd be here for a while. "Do you hike Seymour often?" "Oh yes, Harold and I come up here all the time. It's our favorite mountain. We got engaged up here, you know, back in 1974, right near the summit, on a beautiful clear day. You could see all the way to Vancouver Island." Her eyes got distant when she said it, lost in the memory. I nodded politely, sipping my tea, and my gaze drifted to the logbook on the shelf. I'd never actually looked at it before, had always just signed my name and moved on. But sitting here with nothing to do but wait out the storm, I reached for it. The book was old, weathered, the pages yellowed and wrinkled from years of moisture and cold. The most recent entry was from 3 days ago, a group of 4 hikers noting good conditions and clear weather. I flipped back through the pages, reading scattered entries from the past few weeks, the past few months. Then I found something that made my blood run cold. An entry from the 17th of January, 1976. The handwriting was shaky, desperate, the pencil pressed hard enough to almost tear the page. My wife Margaret became disoriented in the storm. She wandered off while I was setting up camp. "Going down for help. Harold Finch." I read it 3 times, my hand starting to shake. Margaret, Harold. The woman next to me had been talking about someone named Harold. I flipped forward through the years, looking for any follow-up entry, any mention of what had happened. Found nothing. Just the normal progression of hikers signing in and out, commenting on weather and trail conditions, the slow march of decades passing. I looked at the woman sitting beside me. She was still smiling that gentle smile, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door like she was waiting for someone to walk through at any second. "What's your husband's name?" I asked, my voice coming out rougher than I intended. "Harold," she said. "Harold Finch. Have you seen him? Tall man, very fit for his age, wearing a green jacket." My mouth went dry. "And your name?" "Margaret. Margaret Finch." She tilted her head slightly, her smile never changing. "Why do you ask?" I didn't answer. I stood up and went to the small window, looking out at the storm. The snow was still falling thick and heavy, but visibility had improved slightly. I could see maybe 15 meters now, could make out the shapes of trees and rocks through the white. And I could see footprints, fresh ones, leading away from the hut. Not my boots, these were different, older style, the tread pattern simpler, the kind of boots you'd see in outdoor catalogs from the 70s. The prints led away from the door, moved in a wide circle around the hut, then continued on up the trail toward the summit. I watched as more prints appeared in the fresh snow, forming a path that curved back around, creating a loop that returned to the hut from the opposite direction. The prints were being made right now, in real time, by boots I couldn't see. "He's very experienced," Margaret said behind me, and I turned to look at her. She was still sitting on the bench, still smiling, but now I could see something else in her expression. Something desperate and pleading hiding behind that gentle facade. "He knows these mountains so well. He'll find me. He always finds me." "Mrs. Finch," I said carefully, "what year do you think it is?" 1976, she said without hesitation. "January 17th, 1976. Harold and I came up for a winter hike. The weather was supposed to be clear, but the storm came in so fast. I got turned around, couldn't find our camp, so I came to the warming hut to wait. He'll come back for me. He wouldn't leave me up here." I sat back down on the bench, my legs suddenly weak. "Mrs. Finch, I need to tell you something. It's not 1976 anymore. It's 2025, almost 50 years later." She laughed, a light tinkling sound that was somehow more unsettling than if she'd gotten angry. "Don't be silly. I've only been waiting an hour, maybe 2 at the most. Harold will be back any minute now." "The logbook," I said, holding it up. "There's an entry here from Harold. From the 17th of January 1976, he wrote that you became disoriented in the storm, that he was going down for help." Her smile faltered for just a moment, something flickering across her face that might have been recognition or might have been fear. Then it was back, that gentle, patient smile. "You must be reading it wrong. Harold wouldn't leave me. He's just checking the trail. He's very experienced." Through the window, I could see the footprints continuing their endless loop. Out from the hut, around in a wide circle, back toward the hut, then out again. The same path, over and over, boots from 1976 walking through snow that was falling in 2025. "How long have you really been waiting?" I asked quietly. For the first time, her composure cracked. Her hands, folded so neatly in her lap, began to tremble. Her eyes, fixed on the door, started to glisten with tears she wouldn't let fall. "Not long," she whispered. "Just an hour, maybe two, maybe a bit longer, but he'll be back. He has to come back. He wouldn't leave me here alone." I wanted to tell her the truth, wanted to explain that Harold had gone for help 50 years ago and never came back, that she'd been sitting in this hut waiting for him for half a century. But looking at her face, at the desperate hope barely contained behind that smile, I couldn't do it. Some truths are too cruel to speak. "I'm sure he will," I said instead. "I'm sure he's very experienced." She reached out and patted my hand, her touch ice cold. "Thank you. You're very kind. Would you like to wait with me? I'm sure he won't be much longer now." I pulled out my phone, checked for signal. Nothing, which was normal for this elevation. I tried the emergency beacon I carried, but the storm was interfering with the GPS. I was stuck here until the weather cleared, stuck in a warming hut with a woman who'd been dead for 50 years but didn't know it yet. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind howl outside. I checked the window periodically, watched those impossible footprints continue their endless circuit. Always the same path, always the same measured pace, boots that would never wear out searching for someone they would never find. "Do you know what the strange thing is?" Margaret said suddenly, her voice soft and distant. "I can't remember what happened before I got to the hut. I remember the storm starting, remember getting separated from Harold. But then, there's just nothing. And then I was here, sitting on this bench, waiting, and I've been waiting ever since." "How long does it feel like?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it feels like an hour. Sometimes it feels like forever. Time doesn't work right here. Days pass like minutes, or minutes pass like days. I can't tell anymore. But I keep waiting because what else can I do? If I leave, if I go looking for him, I might miss him when he comes back. So I wait. I've always waited." I looked at the logbook again, flipped through decades of entries, hikers commenting on the weather, on their experiences, on the beauty of the mountain. And scattered through the years, maybe once every few winters, someone would mention seeing an elderly woman in the warming hut, always the same description, always waiting for her husband. "Have other people waited with you?" I asked. "Sometimes," she said. "They come in from the storm, like you did. We talk for a while. Then they leave when the weather clears. They always tell me they hope Harold gets back soon. They're very kind." She paused, her smile becoming sad. "Sometimes I think maybe Harold did come back. Maybe he came back while I was distracted by talking to someone. Maybe he looked in and didn't see me and thought I'd already left. Maybe I've been waiting all this time and he's been waiting too, somewhere else, and we just keep missing each other." The storm was starting to ease. Through the window, I could see the snow falling lighter, the visibility improving. I'd be able to hike down soon, get back to my car, go home to my warm apartment and my normal life. And Margaret would still be here, sitting on this bench, watching the door, waiting for someone who'd spent 50 years searching for her in circles. "Mrs. Finch," I said gently, "what if Harold is outside right now? What if he's been walking around the hut all this time, looking for you, and you just can't see him because you're in here?" She turned to look at me with wide eyes, something like hope flickering across her face. "Do you really think so?" "I can see his footprints," I said, which was true. "They circle the hut, over and over, like he's searching." She stood up, moved to the window, pressed her face against the glass. I stood beside her and pointed out the tracks, showed her the endless loop they made through the fresh snow. She watched them for a long time, her breath fogging the window, and I saw tears finally spill down her cheeks. "He's still looking for me," she whispered. "After all this time, he's still looking. Maybe if you went outside," I said carefully, "maybe if you followed the tracks, you could find each other." She pulled back from the window, looked at me with those desperate eyes. But what if I miss him? What if he comes back to the hut while I'm out there? Then I'll wait here, I said. I'll tell him where you went. I'll make sure you find each other. She stood there, torn between the bench where she'd waited for 50 years and the door that led outside to those circling footprints. Finally, slowly, she moved toward the door. Her hand was shaking when she reached for the handle. You'll really wait? You'll tell him I went to find him? I promise. She opened the door and stepped out into the storm, and I watched through the window as she began to follow the tracks. Her figure grew fainter as she walked, not from distance but from something else, some fading that had nothing to do with the snow. She followed the boot prints around the hut, disappearing from view, and I waited for her to reappear on the other side. She never did. The footprints continued their endless loop, but Margaret Finch was gone. Just gone, like she'd never been there at all. Except when I looked at the bench where she'd been sitting, I could see the faint impression of where she'd sat, a slight depression in the wood that looked 50 years old. The storm cleared 20 minutes later. I hiked down in the late afternoon light, my mind reeling from what I'd experienced. When I got home, I researched Harold and Margaret Finch. Found a brief mention in an old newspaper article from February 1976. Couple goes missing on Mount Seymour during winter storm. Harold Finch, 52, descends for help after wife becomes disoriented. Neither seen again. Bodies never recovered. They'd both died up there. Harold somewhere on the trail down, Margaret in the warming hut. He'd spent 50 years walking in circles around the hut where he'd left her, and she'd spent 50 years sitting on a bench waiting for him to return. I hope they found each other when she finally stepped outside. I hope that somewhere in the space between the living and the dead, between 1976 and now, those endless circles finally closed. I hope Harold's search ended and Margaret's wait was finally over. But sometimes, when I hike Seymour in winter, I still see those boot prints in the snow, circling the warming hut over and over, searching for something they'll never find. And I wonder if I sent Margaret out into another kind of waiting, if she's following those tracks eternally now instead of sitting on that bench. I haven't been back to the warming hut. I don't think I can, because I'm afraid I'll find her there again, sitting on that bench with that patient smile, telling me about her husband Harold, who's very experienced and will be back any minute now. Still waiting, always waiting. For someone who's been searching for her for 50 years but will never find his way back.